He thought this invisible world was his own private kingdom, but it was really just endless grass. Back then, our MC's mom told him he needed to grow up and protect the people he loved most. Those were the very last words she ever said to him. His dad also told he didn't want to let down his parents who passed away when he was little, so he did exactly what they wanted. He left home with big dreams in his heart. Then, right when he joined the fight to protect his people and do what his parents wanted. That war didn't stop for 20 long years. Surrounded by non-stop combat, he finally hit the age of 30. They finally signed a peace treaty with the enemy to end the war, and everyone could finally stop fighting and just relax. This guy was even named a hero at one point, mostly because he was such a beast in the war and totally outshined everyone else. The king hyped him up for all those wins and finally gave him what he earned, making him a lord and giving him his very own land to rule. This guy couldn't even read and was only good for fighting, so he had no clue why he was getting all this power until he learned his real job was to protect his people and collect taxes. First up, Diaz had to go see his new land, so he threw his stuff into a cart and started the journey, even though he wasn't exactly hyped about it. He barely had any time to get ready before leaving the capital, and that official was watching his every move the whole time. A voice shouted out and the cart came to a dead stop, making Diaz realize they'd finally reached his land. The guy broke free from his restraints and stopped, thinking they'd finally hit the center. But as the official started pointing out the massive territory borders, Diaz was completely shocked. He's looking at nothing but grass forever, which makes his territory look totally basic. The official told him this was the perfect spot for a guy like him to get to work. So he checked the files and saw the plane was named Neutros, and his own name was Diaz. Starting today, he's officially Diaz Neutros, and a little while later, he heads down to a stream to grab a drink. Diaz chugs some water and lets out a huge sigh, feeling lucky to find a clean source after surviving on nothing but mud during the war. But even after walking for miles, he still hasn't seen a single tree. He decides to give the herb a taste test to see if it's any good, but big surprise, it tastes absolutely disgusting. He flops onto the grass and decides to figure it all out tomorrow, because he seriously needs a plan to stay alive. He's sticking around for 2 more days to help out, then he's leaving this world behind to finally make his parents' wishes come true. Out of nowhere, a guy walks up and asks who he is, then gives the sleeping Diaz a hard kick to wake him up. Diaz opens his eyes to see a young girl right in front of him with a huge horn sticking out of her head. Diaz is totally shocked to see a human, and has no clue what race he is until he spots a horn on her head, while she just keeps demanding to know what he's doing there. The guy wakes up and says his name is Diaz, and since it's obvious he's been crashing there, the girl asks him why he's even sleeping in a place like this. Diaz told her he had nowhere else to crash, and when she asked why he even came to this world, he just said he was told to live here. She asked if he was really that dumb, and Diaz just laughed it off, saying he couldn't deny it since this was his home now. She asks him what he's really after, and Diaz tells her straight up that his only goal is to stay alive. The girl starts pulling out her bow, but the guy suddenly screams for her to just wait and stop. She told him he'd only stay alive if he told the truth, but Diaz insisted he already was. If that's not enough for her, he's also on a mission to honor his parents' final wishes by helping others and protecting anyone who can't fight back. The girl calls him out and asks why he's being so fake, but Diaz just shrugs it off, saying he's got zero reason to lie to her, making her totally snap. Diaz wasn't sure what she was really after, so he tried to stay neutral, but she shut him down and told him he had to pick a side once and for all. Diaz jumps to his feet and yells that he's officially her friend and protector, promising to shield her from anyone who dares to stand in her way. Out of nowhere, the girl's horn starts glowing like crazy, catching Diaz totally off guard while she just stares at the blue flames in total confusion. The blue fire suddenly vanished, and the girl started panicking that it was all a mistake before she grabbed Diaz's hand and bolted, leaving the man shouting for her to stop and explain what she was. The girl told him to just follow her back to her village, and Diaz was totally blown away that a whole town actually existed on this plane. Diaz and the girl finally roll into the village, leaving everyone there totally stunned as they stare the newcomers down. And that wraps up this crazy story. The squad finally makes it to the chieftain's place, and the leader immediately calls out Aruna for bringing a stranger, the very guy responsible for that insane blue light. She told them she found the guy totally knocked out and tried to grill him for info, but he was being super stubborn and asking dumb questions. So she finally asked if he was a friend or an enemy right as a mysterious blue light started to glow. The chief was totally shocked and asked if the light was pure blue with 0 red, and after the girl confirmed it, he asked the guy if he even knew the secret meaning of his own name. The guy says his name is Diaz. The chief tells him that name carries a lot of weight in their secret world. Then he mentions how Diaz claimed to be Aruna's friend. So Diaz finally knows her name is Aruna, and he asks if they're all going to be friends since they're hanging out on his land anyway. The chief asks why he's so sure. Diaz just says it's his job. So when the chief asks who gave him that power, Diaz reveals he works for the king himself. Aruna snaps an arrow onto her bow and aims it right at Diaz, making him freak out and throw his hands up instantly. The chief told him to chill out and stop being so impatient. Then he turned to Diaz and asked him to explain exactly how he ended up getting that order from the very beginning. Diaz wasn't totally sure what beginning to end really meant, but he told his whole life story anyway, starting all the way back from when he was a little kid. The chief finally gets why this guy is glowing blue, and he's totally shocked because he thought only the horn owners could pull that off. So he turns to Diaz and calls him out for being a feudal lord. He's ready to give his all to protect his people, but he wants to hear this guy's side of the story and what happens if they didn't recognize them. So Diaz asks what would have happened if these guys weren't his subjects. And while he thinks it wouldn't matter, the chief tells him they'd still be great friends even. The guy agrees to be neighbors on this plane, and Diaz smiles, saying that if they look out for each other, they're basically friends. The chief is locked in on everything Diaz says, but Diaz is totally confused why he's being grilled. If these people aren't his followers, then who the heck are they? Diaz suddenly realizes these villagers might not actually be his people, but he's in total denial because since this is his land, everything on it has to be his. The chief asked Diaz if he finally got the picture, since he was totally right that these guys weren't his people at all. He straight up admits they're King Diaz's enemies, and have been fighting a massive war against his country for years. They might be the king's enemies, but to him, they're just his friends now. He says Diaz is a blue, the rarest kind ever, which means he can finally live in peace with everyone. So he tells him to look up and asks if he wants to hear his story. This is Mo-Ru, the leader of the Oni, and his people have been locked in a massive power struggle against the country of Diaz for ages. After 50 years of non-stop fighting, they finally lost and were kicked out of the plains after losing almost everyone. Diaz remembered the chief saying they were kicked out of the plains 50 years ago, but he was totally confused about how they were still hanging around. The chief pointed to his horn and said they store magic right inside it, letting them pull off crazy moves that normal people could never even dream of. They use this insane fog magic to hide people in entire houses, letting them sneak back to the plains and stay totally invisible to the kings. Diaz is totally caught off guard, but he's not sure if he should spill the beans since he literally works for the king. The chief says he's only sharing this with Diaz because he's blue, and he'd never tell anyone else. This magic is called the Judgment of Souls, and it'll turn Diaz's soul bright red if he's hiding even a tiny bit of hate. He laughs and asks Diaz if it's even normal for a guy his age to be so obsessed with his parents' last words. He's been around for ages, but he's never. The bosses were hyped that the local lord was such a total idiot, but they knew they couldn't stay in the shadows for much longer. Diaz asks why they're even sticking around when they could just run off to some far-off place and finally live in peace. The chief explains they can't just pack up and leave because their whole survival depends on these Memu cattle that live right here on the plains. He's going to protect his people and become a legendary ruler, but if he fails, nobody has any clue who's taking the throne next. Diaz asks about the guy who came before him, and the chief admits he lived in a totally different spot and was basically a total moron with some really sketchy hobbies. But he actually just died from some sickness, so he tells Diaz he's got no place to stay or any food. And while they're down to help him and even share their animals. He bragged that Diaz keeping quiet meant he was totally safe, and that he could use Aruna now, while the girl just stared him down. The girl suddenly snaps at the chief, demanding to know what he means, but he just tells her she needs to learn how to survive the plains, since she's going to be living with a man now. The Chitin says since Aruna brought this random guy to them, she's the one who has to deal with the mess. Diaz realized his journey as a lord was finally starting, and his first big move was moving in with a girl named Aruna. The Mimeo is a two-horned cow covered in super soft wool, and they're raised specifically for their fluff instead of for meat. The more grass these Mimo munch on, the faster their fur grows, which they shave off and trade for food and gear, and Diaz is like, wait, is that for real? One line out. Rule again. If the input is one block, the output is one block. Drafting the final string, Aruna screamed at the guy. Between Memu, the farming, and the hunting, Diaz realizes he has a ton to learn, and even though Aruna is probably stuck here against her will, she's still doing her best to. Chief Mo-Ru kept his word and handed Maimu over, so to prove he was a worthy leader to the Oni, he decided his first big move as lord was to seriously grow their population. He turns to Aruna and asks for tips on how to grow the population, but she gets totally triggered and snaps back, asking if he's got any other bright ideas. Nobody has a clue how many people live there since they don't keep track, and Arunas tells the guy to shut up because they have way bigger things to worry about, like their supplies. If he's just leading a massive crowd with no resources, they're all gonna end up starving or dead, and she demands to know if he actually gets how bad this is. Diaz said he hoped for more backup once they got more members, but Aruna screamed at him to not even dream about it. Diaz said he totally got it, apologized to the girl, and told her to just forget he even brought it up while he focused on fixing their housing and supply situation. She yanks off the bag and chucks it right at Diaz, who immediately asks what the heck it is. She explains it's matatabi soil made from a grass that wild animals go crazy for, and if you scatter it around, they'll come charging at you instantly. She explains that when a guy hunts, he gets way more than just meat, because he can trade those skins and horns at the village for supplies, or even a brand new yurt. Hunting like this is the perfect way to build up his land, and since Diaz says he's a total pro, he can just shut his brain off and get the job done. Aruna told him to keep the wind at his back until he reached the village, warning that using his power too close would make the animals go crazy. So when Diaz finally hit the open fields, he knew it was time to get started. The guy pulls out a pouch and wonders how much he's supposed to use. He can't remember Aaron giving him any specific instructions. Instead of overthinking it, he decides to just go for. The bag rips open and seeds go flying everywhere, so the guy sighs and says he's finally done it. Now he just has to wait for the animals to show up and figure out how many he's guessing there's only 10 animals, but since he needs 100 for all those yurts, he realizes this is definitely gonna take way longer than a day. Diaz whips around to see a massive wave of animals charging straight for him, and he's totally shocked by just how many there are. He has no clue how these animals got on the plane, but if he catches them all, he hits his goal instantly. Diaz gets ready to scrap, planning to just swing his massive axe with every bit of power he has while trusting his gut. And even though it's a basic move, he's feeling super confident. As a total rookie, he had to learn how to use swords and bows to hit tiny gaps in armor, but it all felt way too confusing for him to get the hang of at first. Reading his opponent's moves and finding the perfect opening was a total struggle, but he refused to admit he was just being an idiot. Right then, that battle axe was a total beast, making fighting super simple. If they had a shield or armor, he just had to smash right through it. It didn't matter what they had, everyone ended up dead the exact same way, and then the animals just shared a look and bolted. Diaz saw them trying to bolt and thought about taking out half the group, which would be a total breeze since their moves were just way too obvious. He scans the field and realizes he totally wrecked the place, seeing animals everywhere and having zero clue how he's gonna move them all. He could have just carried them one by one, but he totally blanked and started swinging his axe like a moron, so now Aruno's gonna be called a fail lord. A bit later, Diaz finally returns, and Aruna is totally hyped, telling him he's a real beast for taking down a black buffalo on his very first hunt. Diaz looked at her confused and asked if that was really a black buffalo, since he managed to take out half the herd before the rest of them bolted. She's totally shocked and asks how many guys he's taken down, but he just casually says it was around 30 or 40. Arunas was screaming about how insane and awesome it was, while the girl started seeing the guy in a totally different way. The chief said the guy did an awesome job without even bragging, and Aruna backed him up, saying she'd never seen anyone so brave in her life. Aruna sprints off to warn the others, shouting that they're gonna move all of Diaz's black buffalo and take him with them. While Diaz was working the grill, the chief totally shocked him by calling him a beast for taking down 30 black buffalo all at once. Diaz paused for a second and asked the chief what he really meant by manliness, because it was clear his idea was totally different from everyone else's. The chief says being a man is all about your worth, which means working hard, being someone people can count on, and always knowing how to get things done. All those traits add up to pure masculinity, and once Diaz asked if he really had it, Arun's whole attitude toward him finally started to change for the better. The chief says Aruno is the hottest girl in the village and she'd definitely be into a guy with his size. But Diaz wants the real truth. Is he actually going to be a... The chief asked Diaz what kind of answer he was looking for, saying that for girls, being a real man is the only thing that matters. But when Diaz wondered if his good looks or marrying a guy who isn't tough means you and your kids are going to starve, because for the women in this tribe, being a real man is the only thing that actually matters. Diaz realized these guys have a totally different way of doing things, and when the chief told him he'd need a bride price to marry Aruna, Diaz was just like... The chief said Aruna was super pretty and a hard worker, so he wanted a huge price, but after catching all those animals, the guy figured it was a fair deal to marry her. Diaz straight up asked if he could actually marry Aruna. The chief told him he had to finish a few tasks first to prove he was ready. Diaz totally thought this meant he was in the clear. He knows he can't do that yet, so he focuses on finding a place to stay and grabbing all the gear he can. The chief told him not to sweat it because his people are compatible with everyone and can totally have kids with other races. Diaz finally wakes up and rolls out of bed, only to find Aruna right there wishing him a good morning and saying she's already got breakfast ready. Diaz sits down and digs in, telling her the food looks amazing, and even though she gets all shy and asks if he's serious, he promises her it tastes incredible. Aruna asks Diaz when he's heading out to hunt, but Diaz is like, "Wait, I thought we were good. Do we actually need more stuff?" Aruna warns that with more people coming, they'll need a well and a storehouse, but hiring a village expert is going to cost them a ton of trade goods. The guy says he's going after Black Buffalo, but Aruna warns him it's a bad move since the village is already set, and then she asks Diaz if he's ever actually taken down a monster before. She asks if they should go hunt monsters, and Diaz realizes these beasts are lurking in every dark corner of the world. They sneak out of the black miasma, creepy dungeons, and old ruins without anyone even noticing. It's like they hate everything that's alive, going totally wild and destroying everything in their path. Their meat and blood are straight up poison, but their skin, horns, nails, and that demon core near the heart are actually super useful for everyday life. Diaz asks if any monsters are lurking nearby, and Aruna tells him they're rare but definitely out there, offering to use her magic to sniff them out if he lets her tag along. Diaz warned her that hunting wasn't some easy stroll through the village and that things could get dangerous, so he just needed her to tell him where to find them. Aruna promised that traveling with Diaz would be a total walk in the park, so he finally gave in and let her tag along. He steps out of the house and catches a good stretch. Then Diaz turns his focus to the Mamu chillin' in their pen. These were a gift from Chief Moru himself. He headed to a nearby stream to wash up and shave, but then he spotted villagers trading a bunch of supplies for buffalo. Diaz is scrambling because he's only half shaved and looks like a total mess, but right then, Aruna shouts that she's finally ready to go. Out of nowhere, the whole village is totally stunned, and as Diaz stares at Aruna, he realizes she looks completely different because her makeup is way more intense than usual. He totally got why she'd changed, and right then, Aruna rushed over to Diaz to tell him she'd put the boys in charge of Mimu. She told him that was the reason they could hang out all day. Diaz could feel all the other guys glaring at him with pure jealousy. He knew they had to get moving and slay those monsters. The Northern Plains have this crazy spot where monsters just keep popping up out of nowhere. DS figures that after taking down just 1 or 2 monsters, they'll have all the materials they need to build a well and a warehouse. Aruna told everyone to step back and let her magic find the monsters. She's not just a pro at chores, she's actually a beast at magic too. Diaz gave her. Aruna smirks, balls up her fists, and starts chanting as a glowing dome surrounds her, but she doesn't stop for a single second. The girl snaps her eyes open and says she found a massive monster, and since it's the only one around, he's definitely the one to blame. Diaz asked if this guy was actually dangerous and told Aruna to go hide while she went to check things out. Aruna says they're sticking together since she's got camouflage magic, and if the monster is way too tough, she'll just use her mist magic so they can bail. DS realized the girl just wouldn't quit, but since Aruna was safe, he knew everything was totally fine. They head out and start scaling a massive rocky mountain, but suddenly Aruna freezes in terror as she locks eyes with the monster. Diaz asks if that thing is seriously just a turtle, but Aruna reveals it's actually an earth dragon, and now they're all wondering why a monster like that is even showing up here. Diaz is hyped to take on whoever shows up and tells Aruna to hide, while she warns the girl not to be reckless since no human can actually beat an earth dragon. Diaz says they can just bail if things get scary, but what happens if he starts chasing them? The earth dragon suddenly spots him, but Diaz isn't letting that slide, knowing that if he goes for the neck or legs, the beast will just hide like a turtle, and Diaz figures he's just gotta go for it. But when he smashes the shell, his axe literally cracks, and he realizes this thing is way tougher than he thought. He goes straight for the neck, but the turtle slips away, so Diaz keeps throwing huge swings while Aruna watches every single move. Diaz dives out of the way and stares at the curled-up beast, realizing it's plugging the hole with its shell, a move he never expected from a dragon. Aruna's totally freaked out and tells Diaz to run for his life since soloing an earth dragon is impossible, but Diaz refuses to leave without giving it everything he's got. He knows Aruna is going to call him a total idiot again, but he's got nowhere else to attack, so if the first hit doesn't work, he's just going to have to strike twice. If that fails, you gotta land 3 hits because that's just how he rolls, and he'll keep spamming that move until he's totally gassed out. He slams his axe into the monster so hard the blade actually starts to crack, leaving Aruna totally stunned while DS realizes he almost shattered his own weapon. DS grabs the hammer and pops his repair skill, fixing it in a flash and leaving Aruna totally speechless, though he totally expected her to freak out since he was just as shocked the first time he He scored this axe back when he was just a total newbie, taking it as a trophy from an enemy he crushed in battle. He kept the axe because it looked awesome and was super tough, plus it can even heal itself whenever it gets a scratch. His body heals on autopilot, but he can manually trigger it again with his mind, and Diaz says he's all good but needs a second round. Time is ticking away, and Diaz is drenched in sweat because he can't even scratch that shell. And since night is falling, they're forced to retreat, leaving him crushed that he can't even... Diaz looks over at Aruna and realizes she's shivering like crazy, making him think he should probably just stop. Diaz keeps slamming his axe into the shell until cracks start spreading everywhere, and Aruna is totally shocked that he actually managed to break through. The turtle realized its shell was busted, so it popped a skill and slammed into Diaz, leaving Aruna totally terrified for him. Diaz finally lands a clean hit right on the turtle's legs. He realizes he can actually fight back now. The guy holds up his axe to block the strikes, but then, Aruna noticed the earth dragon was leaking that nasty magic mist again, and even from way back, she could still feel it, making her wonder why Diaz wasn't affected at all. Diaz figures the monster isn't even gonna fight back, so he stays quiet and just keeps hammering away at that crack. Out of nowhere, the turtle's head snaps out to attack and shoots a blast straight at Diaz. He realizes it's the first time anyone's ever cracked that turtle shell, and now he's attacking like a total maniac because this earth dragon is absolutely losing its mind. If he keeps this up, the loot is basically his, but then the monster charges right at Aruna and she has to dive out of the way. DS sees her lying there totally still and screams her name, but the monster hears him and charges right for her while Aruna stares at the beast in total terror. Diaz realizes the monster isn't even targeting him. It's going straight for Aruna, and he's about to go totally berserk. He promised her he'd be her friend, and no matter how insane that monster is, he's standing his ground to fight. Diaz smashes right through the monster's shell, and seeing it's finally stopped moving, he leaps off and rushes over to Aruna to check if he's all right. Out of nowhere, Aruna lunges at DS and starts sobbing into a massive hug, suddenly blurting out that she wants to marry him. Suddenly, voices start shouting for Aruna and Diaz because they'd been gone for so long that everyone finally came looking for them. They spot the Earth Dragon's lifeless body, and right there next to it are DS and Aruna's. Diaz realized Arun's grip was way stronger than a dragon's, and since he couldn't break free, he just begged him to chill out and stop crying. Diaz and Aruna started making their way back to the village. The villagers totally lost it when they saw that Diaz had actually taken down the Earth Dragon. They were even hauling the monster's massive body. DS realized this turtle was insanely heavy, and even with the whole village helping him haul it, they didn't make it back until the next morning. The chief turned to Diaz, totally blown away that one guy actually took down an Earth Dragon all by himself. She's totally shocked that the deadly magic mist didn't even touch them. And since the loot is still in perfect condition, it's worth a massive fortune that they don't have anything. For a tiny cut of the loot, they'll chop up the body for parts and even build a well in a warehouse. They're also throwing in a yard and a storage spot to keep all. Now they can finally trade with the merchants passing through. This is a huge win since it helps the Lord get on their good side. Right after that, the chief starts talking about Aruna. Her parents would totally flip for any guy who brings them dragon loot. But Diaz stops her cold to ask why she's even talking about a wedding gift. The chieftain made it clear the wedding was happening whether he liked it or not. But she was already stressing that having a dragon slayer living right outside the village would turn everyone's doubt into straight. Just think about how manly they look after slaying that dragon. And if he rejects Aruna, every girl in the village is gonna go wild trying to win him over, leaving her wondering how. Out of nowhere, Diaz spots a little girl holding onto his leg. Then he looks up and sees a whole crowd of girls staring at the dude. The chief says the girls are just waiting around because kingdom guys only pick one wife, and they're all convinced Aruna is still a virgin. Diaz asked if he was basically being forced to get married, especially since the chief was already busy setting up an engagement for him. The lady asked about the engagement, but they don't even do that where they're from, and Aruna had already rushed off to tell her parents she was getting married. All he had to do was pick a date or make a deal they both liked, and just like that, Diaz and Aruna were officially married. Aruna was basically the total package since she was stunning, super sweet, and even kept the house perfect, making him realize that maybe this whole thing was actually a great idea. He's 35 and knows it's finally time to get married, so he starts wondering how old Aruna is, and asks the guy next to him if he knows her age. This guy knows Aruna just turned 15 and tells her she's super lucky to have met Diaz right when she's old enough to get married. DS knew she'd be young, but they looked more like a father and daughter, even though the kingdom's law says she has to be at least 18. She won't be 18 for 3 more years, so they're staying engaged while he levels up his skills as a lord to get ready for the wedding. He realizes he can't just half-heartedly agree because that would be a total slap in the face to her feelings. So he decides to go all in to prove his loyalty as both her. A month passes since Aruna and Hugh got engaged, and with their new well and warehouse finally finished, they're living it up and enjoying all the perks. But one thing is still the same. 0 new people have joined his field. And even though he's got some ideas to fix that, he's not even sure if they'll actually work. He used to see Aruna as just another one of the Lord's soldiers, but now she's family, and he's low-key wishing more people would just drop from the sky to help out. Out of nowhere, Aruna screams that they're having a baby, and Diaz is so shocked he drops his water jug right on the spot. Diaz asks if she's totally sure, and Aruna confirms they're finally having a baby, making them both shout out in total victory. A bit later, the guy is stuck babysitting Frances. He admits he never expected her to get pregnant so quickly. Suddenly, Francois walks right up to him. Diaz looks him in the eye and asks. Diaz remembered Aruna saying the Memu were super smart and could actually understand humans, using those big brains to survive in such a brutal world. It's actually insane that even a wild Memu can learn to talk in just a week. That's exactly how she ended up living with people. And the best part is, once they realized humans would give them free food and keep them safe, they decided to ditch the wild and just become domesticated. Arunus dropped a bombshell that it wasn't all good news, explaining that even the smartest Mimas get totally terrified when they're pregnant, though sometimes they just stop being afraid altogether. The group has to stick right by Diaz since he's the strongest, because being near him is the only way they can keep from totally freaking out. It was way worse at night while they were passed out, so Diaz claimed he totally got it and just had to crash there with them, but Arunus immediately called him out on his lie. Aruna told everyone they were moving to the yurt, but the guys were totally against it because the place would get gross, and they couldn't chill with Mamua staring them down the whole time. Diaz was shocked that was all they needed, telling them it was no big deal since Francis and Francois were family, and he'd do anything for their baby. Arunus was super happy to hear him say that, realizing he was actually a really kind and manly guy after all. Diaz thinks all the Mimu sound exactly the same, but Aruna can actually pick up on tiny shifts in their voices, even though he still has no clue what they're actually saying. The girl asked Francis what she was talking about, so Arunus jumped in to say she and Diaz weren't actually married yet, and that Francis was acting totally out of line. Aruna asks what's wrong with them just hanging out to get closer. Then she says everything is totally fine and she's not holding anything back. The girl told Mimu that everything was totally fine, and asked her to just stay out of their private business. Diaz spots a weird green glow on the girl's horn he's never seen before, and Aruna panics as she realizes the magic barrier has been tripped by a mystery person coming from the east. She realizes they look like 10-year-old kids on horseback. But Diaz sees that green glow by the horn, and knows an invasion is coming right for the kingdom to the east. He senses someone's coming, and since bandits are a total nightmare, he heads out to investigate while Aruna uses her magic to hide everything. The guy turns to Mimu and says he'll be right back, since there's only 10 of these dudes and they definitely aren't tougher than the dragon. Aruna flashed a smile and said she'd handle the house, telling Diaz she was totally counting on him. The guy charges straight at the intruders, yelling that there are 3 riders and 4 on foot, but Aruna corrects him, saying there are actually 10 of them total once she counts the horses. There's no way these guys are friendly, and while those bows are definitely trouble, he's got a little surprise for them, until one of the warriors suddenly shouts Dee's name. The guy is super hyped and says it's been way too long, and that's when Diaz realizes it's actually Klaus, his old partner from the battlefield. Even though Klaus was just a commoner, he earned total respect and became a ride-or-die friend you could trust with your life. Dia was hyped to see him and asked what he was doing there, so Klaus told him he's currently working as a guide and a bodyguard. Klaus says some fancy nobles reached out with a favor, but then he spots the girl and starts wondering what her deal is. Klaus asked the guy to lead them back to his place since the whole crew was totally beat from their long trip. Diaz asked if they were talking about his place and told them he'd lead the way to his house. Klaus was super pumped to finally see Diaz's domain, and he was already losing his mind just imagining how epic it would be. They finally reach a flat field where Diaz thought they'd only hidden the practice spot, but the magic worked so well it actually blew his mind. Diaz swings the door open and tells everyone to stop being shy and get inside, but once they step into the yurt, it's completely empty. She tells Diaz it's a massive honor to finally meet him, revealing she's actually the 3rd princess, Diana. Diana asked what kind of tent this even was, since she was sure the guy's mansion was still being built, but she couldn't see or hear any workers at all. Diaz starts to speak, but a knight shuts him down, calling him a total fool and telling him he better address Her Royal Highness as Diana and know his place. Diana barked at the knight to stop, while Diaz admitted he didn't have any workers or fancy land. This tent was literally all he had, and he'd actually hurt himself. Everyone was losing their minds, and Diana asked if he really built it with his own 2 hands. But when she looked for his crew, Diaz just said there wasn't anyone else out in this empty wasteland. She asked why he didn't just hire some locals, but he knew Diaz was totally loaded after the king gave him a massive budget to build the land, and a huge bonus for being a hero. Diaz told them he knew the deal, but he hadn't seen a single copper coin, any money to build the town, or even basic supplies. He thought he'd end up dying like a dog on the side of a road that didn't even exist, and Klaus was totally losing it with rage after hearing that. Diaz asks Diana why she's there, and she tells him the war is calling for the hero to return. With things getting super dangerous in the kingdom, she tracks down the hero and begs him to use his insane power to help her. Diana told him his reward was a wife, and he could choose her or pick between the 2 girls behind her, Priscilla and Merda. Diaz thinks about the war and figures she's gotta be kidding, because there's no way she's leaving Francis behind to marry some guy she literally just met. He's convinced Aruna is already his, so he tells Diana he's got bigger plans, and is officially dropping out of the war. He can't give them any backup because, as you can see, this lord can't even send out one single warrior. Diana clenched her teeth and begged the guy to rethink his choice, even promising a massive bonus to sweeten the deal. Diaz says he's sorry, but he won't help no matter what the reward is, so he tells everyone to just get lost. The knight started trashing the guy, yelling that the princess herself asked for help, and he had the nerve to just say no to her face. Klaus tried to step in, but the guy just ignored him and said Diaz was way too full of himself. In a flash, Diaz smashed the knight's sword with his axe and took him out, leaving everyone shocked as a sharp piece of metal flew right past a frozen Klaus. Diaz could feel the guy's insane bloodlust and tried to act tough to scare him off. Then he just dropped his axe and told everyone the conversation was over, and they needed to get out. Klaus rushed over to Knight and told him they had to bail immediately, warning the guy to stop talking before things got really messy. Cloud just smirks and tells them they don't stand a chance even if they all team up, asking if he's really brave enough to try and fight a hero. Diaz is absolutely fuming. He realizes he totally overdid it and smashes the floor to pieces. Now this guy is terrified, thinking Aruna is definitely going to end him. Diana realized the vault was bone dry and the army was nowhere to be found, which was the exact opposite of what she'd been promised, so she straight up called Diaz a total failure. She cursed him out for tossing her aside like literal garbage and swore she'd make him pay so hard he'd regret everything. Diaz watched them leave as Arunas pointed out that all the women were glowing red, one soldier was glowing blue, and the rest were just red or white. She asked the guy if she'd actually freaked him out. She knew Francis was about to burst into tears, and when she did, she just wanted to be right by his side. Diaz pulled Francis into a hug and said he was sorry he couldn't stay. Then the rest of the crew walked up and he started giving everyone head pats. Diaz says that red glow means those women are out for blood, so are they actually a threat to Aruna too? Aruna says the Soul Court proved they're both in huge danger just because they're family, and Diaz totally agrees. He figures these 3 were actually enemies, so he definitely can't trust their talk about war and marriage, and he's glad he just kicked them out. Arunas mentioned a soldier was glowing blue, probably just the clouds, and Diaz smiled as he remembered the guy's friendly face. Aruna points out the floor is a total wreck, and Diaz just nods like he's got it all figured out. A bit later, the floor is finally fixed, and Diaz snaps awake to some movement as the guy says good morning to Francis and Francois. Aruna was busy whipping up some breakfast. She told the guy good morning and set the food down on the table. But then, out of nowhere, her horn started glowing. Aruna shouts that there's an intruder, and since he's all alone, she's got the full scoop on him. It's a guy over in the east, but he looks... Diaz didn't buy the Traveler Act and asked if he was really alone. Then while Diaz was waiting outside, Arunashim suddenly showed up with Francis and Francois, as the man asked if the girl... Aruna says there's only one guy, so it's no big deal. They'll just sneak past him. And since she can't stand seeing Francis cry, she's coming along whether he wants her there or not. Diaz gives the girl a grin and nods along. Then a bit later, he heads across the field and spots a familiar face, asking if it's really Klaus, who is totally hyped to see him. Klaus tried to find his way back but ended up totally lost, and since there was nothing but grass around, Dia figured he'd already headed back to the kingdom with the girls. Diaz asks Klaus where all his gear went, but Klaus just laughs and says he got kicked out, then demands his sword and armor back, leaving Diaz totally stunned. He asked if they were really his own kind, and if they were back because he'd just kicked them out. But Cloud told him that wasn't the case, even though he totally... Cluse asked Diaz if he was even listening, because a new war is about to pop off and he's going straight back to the front lines. This wasn't part of his plan at all, so he used the chance to find a friend while chasing the one thing he wants to do more than anything else. Diaz asks Klaus what he's so hyped to do, and Klaus straight up asks if he can join his squad as a soldier. Diaz knew they fought with total trust, and since nobody had his back like Klaus, he was just hyped to have him as an ally. Diaz starts stressing out and shaking his head, but then Aruna suddenly pops up and tells him everything's fine if he's just worried about her, while Klaus, who's been glowing with... Aruna asks Diaz if he wants to talk things over, giving him a bright smile that he quickly returns. Klaus asked about the mysterious lady and her sheep, but Diaz just said it was a long story, and now Diaz finally had his very first ally and subject. Back during the war, Klaus begged his captain to stay, asking if they were really just gonna ditch these people. But the captain claimed they were only pulling back to get some backup. Klaus looked at the man and asked who would fight the enemy if they ran, especially since the nearby shelter was full of women and kids. The captain says it's all up to God now and just bails, leaving Clouds begging him to wait up. Mainu is busy munching on grass and Aruno is cooking up a meal, while Diaz and Klaus work together to build a brand new yurt for Klaus. Diaz said he was cool with the yurt, but since he totally ripped it apart, they didn't want to give him a broken home, so they just built him a brand new one. Aruna called the guys over to eat, but Diaz was totally shocked when he suddenly spotted a black buffalo. Everyone gathers around the table as Diaz thanks Aruna for the meal and tells Klaus to quit yawning, but Klaus just says the food is so good it's literally fit for a lord. Klaus tells Aruna she'd be an amazing wife, and Diaz totally agrees, so Aruna tells him to keep eating since they have tons of food, and Klaus gives her a big thanks. Diaz walks up to Aruna to talk gear, telling her they can use their stash of dragon parts to forge some epic new weapons and armor. Aruna says they could do that, or just follow the village and start making Nekatore, since every part of a dragon is super useful, and they don't want anything going to waste. They're turning those fangs and claws into swords and bowstrings, using the shells for shields, and Diaz says they'll burn through way more gear if they trade at the village. Diaz notices Klaus looking totally stressed and asks what's up, so Klaus double-checks if he really mentioned a dragon, and when Diaz says yes, Klaus reveals he's already hunted one down and has all the loot to prove it. Diaz said it was an earth dragon, and he actually smashed its shell to kill it, even though it just looked like a giant turtle that couldn't even fly, which is crazy because Klaus thought it would take a whole army of knights with heavy weapons to stop it. Klaus asks if Diaz is seriously gonna blow all that rare loot on him, but Diaz says it's because he wants Klaus to lead his army one day. If they're just gonna lie there, what's the point? Klaus is shocked, but he tells Diaz he's got his back and is even ready to die for him. Klaus promises Diaz and Aruna he'll protect their home no matter who attacks, and when Diaz tells him to stop being so formal, Klaus says he has to show him some respect. Diaz was stoked that Klaus loved the gear, and it wasn't long before Klaus was already out there testing his brand new armor and spear. 10 days later, the spear and armor are finally finished, and since they're made entirely of dragon parts, Klaus is pretty sure even a king couldn't afford this gear. Klaus thinks back to Diaz and realizes the guy has total faith in him, so he's determined to actually live up to it. The capital is a total disaster zone right now because everyone's fighting over the throne, and with all these nobles busy plotting against each other, the lords out in the countryside are doing whatever they want since nobody is watching them. On his way here, Klaus saw how evil Lord Kazdex really is, and it looks like the greedy second prince totally swiped Diaz's reward. Word on the street is that the third princess, Diana, is way better at politics than fighting, so she's definitely trying to charm Diaz into giving her his support. This massive fight for the throne is about to shake the entire country to its core, and that's exactly why he finally showed up. If Klaus heads back to the battlefield, he knows he might not make it out alive, but he's totally fine with dying for Diaz if it means he finally gets to go out like a... Kluk spots Diaz holding a gun and walks right up to ask him what the heck happened. Diaz says Aruna spotted 12 intruders coming from the east, and since one of them is basically at death's door, he wants to rush over there right now while Klaus asks if he should. Diaz tells Klaus to stay put, because if things get too dangerous and the girls have to run, he needs Klaus right there to keep them safe. Klaus says he's totally down to help, so Diaz and Aruna head out while she hides everything behind a massive wall of fog. Klaus realized it was Aruna's hiding magic since they just melted away, and he was totally blown away by how insane her power was. Klaus spots Diaz and is totally thrown off because they're back way earlier than expected, and he's super confused to see Diaz and Aruna leading a bunch of random strangers. A bit later, Aruna was busy helping the seniors and bringing them food. Dia realized these poor women had actually been dumped there. Since things were getting desperate, the village kicked them out just to... It all started when Duke Kazdix's second son kicked off a massive rebellion. He's trying to take down his useless dad and the older brother who's next in line. Granny Maya is the boss of this group, and she used her magic visions to lead everyone on a massive journey to safety, while Dia screams to Klaus that they actually pulled it off. Diaz was totally hyped to score 12 new recruits in just one day, while Klaus sat back and planned exactly what he was going to say next. Since they got kicked out, he gets to decide their fate, but they won't be able to help much because Diaz realized they're all in their 70s, and Grandma Maya. Since these guys live for ages, he's hoping they'll spill the secret to their long lives. But Klaus asks Diaz if they could actually drop dead any second, which is the whole reason. Diaz grabs the logs and says they need more yurts, making Klaus think back to the day the whole village found out their camp was taken over by the enemy. They couldn't just ditch the village and let it fall, but Klaus got left behind and realized the enemy was already there to finish him off. Out of nowhere, Diaz pops up, totally hyped to see Klaus, and says that since everyone else bailed, he thought he was all alone. So Klaus asks him where he's. Diaz heard a baby crying, so he went to check it out and ended up holding the little guy in his arms. Diaz heads to the shelter and tries to find someone to take the kid, but the boy starts bawling and begs him not to go because he's totally freaked out. Diaz flashed a smile and told the kid not to worry because he had his back, asking him to just hang tight for a little longer. Diaz slams the shelter shut and stands his ground as a bunch of angry soldiers charge straight for them. Then he tells Klaus he better not die, and Klaus gives a super nervous nod. Everything after that is a total blur to him. Standing right by Diaz with the shelter at his back, he swings his sword with every bit of power he's got left. He honestly has no clue. He was positive that staying back would give Diaz the perfect opening to finish off the enemy. It was honestly the smartest play he could make in that situation. By the time backup finally showed up the next, Klaus realized Diaz hadn't changed one bit, because even after making it big, he was still the same super nice and honest guy he'd always been. Klaus looked at the crowd and realized he'd been acting like a total idiot. He used to think he needed some big, honorable death to go out right. But now he knew. Klaus promised to help out and told Diaz to stop yanking so hard before he totally ripped the yurt apart. It's been a few days since they let the old ladies stay, and after Aruna saw their souls were a peaceful blue, she knew they were totally safe. So now that he asks if they should name it Eluk, which is an old-school name that literally means the first village. Klaus blurts out that Dragonslayer Village is a sick name, but Aruna shuts him down immediately, while Diaz realizes that's basically how his very first village got its start. Everyone was hyped to celebrate with a little party, and even though Diaz kept it low-key, seeing all those happy faces finally made her crack a smile. He's got to do everything he can to keep the smiles coming, so Aruna walks up and asks if he's got a second to talk about the population growth. She said sorry for the interruption, but they had to settle this fast, so she asked him what he thought about their earlier conversation. Diaz remembered their talk about how to bring in new settlers, but he was totally blanking on any good ideas. He had his own plan, but he scrapped it right away. Grandma Maya's idea was definitely going to be the fastest and easiest way out. Out of nowhere, Maya walks up to Diaz and asks if he actually called her name. She heard him calling her name, but Diaz was positive he hadn't said a word, and then she told him she wanted to finish their talk from the night before. She asked him what his deal was with having servants, since selling dragon loot would give him enough cash to buy a ton of workers and blow up the population, so she just didn't get why. Diaz figured this was all Grandma Maya's big idea. In this world, if you sell your soul like a product, you're basically just a servant. These guys are so cheap that Dia admitted he had a major beef with the ministry after seeing the total nightmare of servant soldiers being used on the battlefield. He could just treat his servants better, but Diaz says the real problem is that he bought them in the first place. Whenever servants sell out, those greedy merchants just go out and restock, and if they see him buying, they're just gonna kidnap even more people because he knows for a fact Diaz banned anyone from owning or selling servants on her land, and Maya was super relieved to find out he actually hated the whole idea of slavery. She mentioned someone probably tried to boost the population by just buying servants, and while she was totally ready to stop them, she's just relieved it didn't actually happen. Diaz told her to just speak up if something was bugging her, and Maya totally agreed that he was right. Maya's heard all the crazy stories about Kazdex's servants, and she's so caught up in her feelings that she actually apologizes to the guy. Diaz told her to stop worrying because he wasn't going to let anything happen, making Aruna ask if he actually had a secret plan up his sleeve. Klaus jumps in and asks if Diaz is actually with Aruna, mumbles a quick apology for the interruption, but then he spots Maya and swears he didn't see a thing. Aruna rushes up to Diaz and tells him she spotted a merchant on the path, so he agrees it's time for them to get moving. They're super hyped for these traders to arrive because it's not just about the loot. They want to spread the word about their home and dig for some info, and since even Dia, the merchant walks up, But Diaz is totally shocked to see a giant frog instead of a human, and the creature asks if he's really the legendary dragon slayer everyone's talking about. The merchant introduces himself as Pigeon and wants to make a deal. But when Arunas points out that he's actually a frog, everyone loses it because they can't believe Pigeon heard that Diaz actually took down the Earth Dragon, so he asked to see all the epic loot he scored from the beast. Aruna checked Pigeon's soul and saw it was white, meaning he wasn't a threat. But since the guy only wanted to trade and wasn't exactly a good person, Diaz had no idea how to handle a deal with him. Diaz pulls out a piece of the dragon's shell and asks Pagan if something's wrong, but Pagan admits he thought the beast would be way smaller since he heard Diaz took it down all by himself. He says sorry for being a jerk and asks if he really soloed that Earth Dragon, but Dia wonders if the guy thinks he just found a dead body. He realizes the merchant is totally onto him now, which is a huge problem, so he tells Klaus to drop a shell to mark the spot while he runs to grab his axe. Diaz finally shows up with an axe and shatters the dragon's shell into a bunch of pieces with just one swing. Paige is totally shocked, and Cloud yells that he saw the hit that took the dragon down, while DS realizes that out of all the loot, the shell was the biggest pain to break apart. He just wanted to help the others with their work, so he grabbed his axe and marched right up to that shell. A few days later, he finally figured out how to crack that shell in just one hit. Klaus told him to call it the Dragon Slayer Strike. Diaz realized right then that Klaus was totally. Klaus turns to Paige and asks if he actually believes him, so Paige asks if he can buy those broken shell pieces. He tells the helpers to start unloading the cart since he can't pay with just coins, and they get right to work. Pajin says he'll find a way to pay for it, and since he's a legit merchant, he's gonna figure out the fair price for the item. Paige tells his crew to bring someone else out, figuring that since Mr. Diaz is human, he might actually want to buy these monsters that are banned on Earth. Out of nowhere, two elf twins stepped out of the carriage holding hands, but their eyes looked totally dead. Aruna, Klaus, and Maya's faces dropped instantly, and Paige knew right then he'd totally messed up. He saw how ticked off Diaz looked, but Diaz was just staring at the twins' blank eyes, realizing they were orphans just like him, and remembering Paige said they couldn't even be sold. Diaz realized Pagan was actually selling these twins like they were just items, but right as he was getting heated, Aruna grabbed his hand and told him to stay cool. Maya says Diaz looks way too scary for the kids, so the woman tells Mr. Page they aren't looking to buy servants, which totally shocks him since he thinks they've got the whole situation wrong. He said these twins weren't actually servants, and if he hadn't taken them in as property, they'd have been dead a long time ago. These two were born as twins in a village that totally hated them. Everyone there thought twins were cursed monsters who brought bad luck to everyone, so the village actually planned to execute them. Their parents weren't having any of it. They grabbed their kids and bolted from the village to hide where no one would ever find them. That's exactly when Paige ran into them. Living in the wild was a total nightmare, and both parents ended up getting really sick. They could tell they were dying fast, so they begged Pesini to take the kids and keep them safe. Paige is a traveling merchant, so he shut them down and told them he doesn't do handouts. The parents were literally begging him to take the twins like they were just property. Paige was down for it, because when they were literally about to die and begging him with every last cent they had, he just couldn't say no. He promised to keep them safe until he could find a decent buyer, since nobody actually cares about cursed kids. He's completely out of cash, so feeding them is just a total loss. But then he runs into DS and starts apologizing like crazy because he never meant to hurt anyone. Aruna used her horn to see that Pagan wasn't lying, and she realized these kids actually had glowing blue souls. Diaz was totally down to take the kids, promising to trade dragon parts to cover all the costs and keep them safe, and when he asked if that worked, Paige said it sounded like a perfect deal. Diaz was totally against buying them at first, but knowing they have nowhere else to go changes everything, so he decides to make these twins more than just his subjects. They're family now. After leaving the plains, Paisyon was totally stoked, calling Diaz his best customer ever since they sold out of everything, and he loved how easy it was to work with simple-minded guys. The shirtless guy asked Paige if this dude would get in the Beast King's way, but Paige told him it was no big deal. A guy who's just happy living in his tiny village out in the plains isn't a threat to anyone. Plus, he didn't have a single clue about what was really happening. Plus, if Master Diaz keeps growing his village, he's eventually gonna run straight into those mountains north of the plain. Sure, these mountains are crawling with monsters, but they're also packed with a ton of valuable minerals. If he takes over this place, his trading partners are going to make a massive fortune. Piggin says that since he's the main merchant, he's definitely getting a fat cut of the profits. Diaz finally finished his first deal with Pagan without a single problem, already setting up the next trade and looking for new people to join his land. Diaz suddenly walks up and scoops the twins into his arms, asking their age with a big smile since they're way too skinny and need to start eating for real. He tells them Aruna is a great cook and they should all eat together. The guy introduces himself and asks the girls for their names. He asks if they have a favorite game. The guy asked what they liked to eat and offered to whip it up for them. He asked about their favorite songs and stories. Then he asked if they liked playing with toys. He even tried asking for, since their parents loved them enough to leave their homes behind, these kids obviously love them back, so they should really treasure the names their parents gave them. The guy asks if they really don't have names. He realizes he's gonna have to name them all over again. Don't let his looks fool you, because he's actually a... The girls totally freaked out and said no way, but Diaz still asked for their names because he really needed to know. The girls introduced themselves as Sene and Ichin, which totally caught Aruno off guard, but Diaz just thanked them and told them they were super cute. He's seen way too many kids shut themselves away and lose their minds, and it almost always ends in a total disaster. Turns out making them remember their parents was the perfect way to finally crack their shells. Diaz and Klaus get busy sorting through their loot, so Aruna and Granny Maya help them gear up in their new outfits while the girls start whipping up some food. The twins agree and head off with Aruna and Maya, who tells them to follow along while Maya promises they'll get some steamed potatoes later. Klaus was totally shocked that Diaz was so good with kids, but Diaz revealed that before the war, he actually looked after a bunch of orphans and even took care of a newborn baby. Klaus asks about the names, and Diaz explains there were 10 kids he left with a caretaker before heading to war, just hoping they're all doing okay now. Klaus hoped they'd hear the news and show up one day, so he finished hauling all the gear into the warehouse until the job was finally done. Aruna, Maya, Sina, and Ikin meet up with Diaz and Klaus, and since Sina and Ikin are rocking fresh new outfits, Diaz gets super hyped and tells the girls they look totally adorable. Aruna told Diaz he looked like a total mess and needed to clean up, so he admitted she was right, and headed to the stream with Clace to scrub off all that dirt. A little while later, they headed back to the group where the girls were rocking some super cool braids the locals did for them, and Aruna's promised they'd be able to do it themselves once they grew up. Right then, Maya realized these twins definitely weren't human. Even so, she had a really good feeling about them showing up. They were just too adorable to ignore, so she decided. Diaz walked over and told Shania and Ion their new hair looked amazing, so the girls flexed their jewelry and talked about how pretty it was, making Diaz realize they were finally starting to open up. Aruna calls Senai and Iken over to give them some jewelry, explaining that in an ancient language, Senai means beautiful as the moon, and Iken means sacred. She has no clue why their parents picked those names, but she's sure they're tied to the moon, which is why they were given these special stones called Iwa that hold moon. Sinai and Ihan share the meanings behind their names, and thinking about their parents makes them both burst into tears. They remember telling their girls they loved them more than anything, and just wanted them to be happy forever. The girls dash over to DS and Aruna for a massive hug, while Mimel walks up to DS, and Aruna says it looks like Mimel wants to help out since they're all total pros at cheering up kids. The girls spot Mimu and immediately sprint over for a massive hug. Diaz calls Aruna and brings up how she used that ancient language when she was naming the village. He was totally convinced that only. He asks if Senai and Aishin's parents were somehow tied to the only people. But Aruna is totally clueless since that ancient language is basically just a legend, and Aruna drops a bombshell that the girls' parents weren't even human, suggesting their ancestors mixed with the original people way back when, and then they spot the girls fast asleep on Mimu. 10 days have passed, and even though Sin and Ihan are still hurting over their parents, they're finally moving forward and filling the village with their smiles and laughter again. The whole village started treating them just like their own kids. Suddenly, the girls felt a weird vibe and started looking at me in a whole new way. Aruna warned Diaz that someone was riding in fast. Aruna warns he's showing up any second. Diaz spots them coming from the east again and heads out to meet them, while the man starts calling for Aruna, Francis, and Francois. Mimu starts chatting someone up, and Arunas explains they're actually sticking around this time because they hate being away from the DS. But since Sinai and Ikan are finally here, Dia told them he got the plan and would be back soon, saying he was counting on them right as the girls suddenly walked up to the guy. Sin told Diaz to get back home as fast as he could and promised they'd be waiting, so Diaz just flashed a smile and agreed. DS stood out on the plane waiting for the guy to show up while Aruna hid in the fog with her magic, and she gave him the heads up the moment he finally arrived. She looked at the old man and saw his soul was pure white, so she knew he wasn't looking for a fight. The guy catches up to Diaz, jumps off his horse, and apologizes for the surprise visit, calling Diaz his master and guessing he's finally found the right person. Diaz asks the guy who he is, and he says his name is Camelot, sent there to represent Duke Kazdex. Elden Kazdex is already on his way to see Lord Diaz and even offered to take him back to his house, but Diaz says they're meeting right here. The guy looks up and catches Diaz's death stare, so he bows and promises to deliver the message to his lord. Diaz was convinced Elden Kazdex was the womanizer who sparked the whole civil war, and there was no way he'd let a guy like that reach Eluk village. A bit later they spot this massive cart, and while Aruna is totally confused, she notices the big guy there has a glowing blue soul, and even though the people around him are a total mix, there isn't a single red soul in the bunch. Diaz was totally shocked and asked why the guy had a blue aura, but Arunas told him it was the most intense blue she'd ever seen, second only to Diaz himself. The guy hopped off the cart and apologized like crazy, saying he just absolutely had to see Diaz. The guy says his name is Elden Kazdex, but Diaz can just call him Elden, and he's basically a total fanboy because he's heard all the epic stories about the legendary hero. He said that's exactly why he wanted to meet the guy and get to know him, promising he wouldn't do anything disrespectful so Diaz would just chill out. D.A. hoped old Elden wasn't salty and apologized for being a jerk to his guy, but Elden told him to drop the formal act since he was just hyped to finally meet him. Elden points out a girl hiding nearby, making Aaron freak out, but Elden says his sharp ears and nose caught her because she smells just like Diaz. Diaz is totally shocked that Elden saw through the illusion, so Aruna decides to show herself, and Elden immediately demands to know who she is and what her deal is with Diaz. Dia introduces the girl as Aruna and says they're engaged, but she claims she's actually his wife, and Dia just totally rolls with it. Elden asks Aruna if she's an Ajan, but she's totally clueless because she's actually an Oni born with a horn and has never even heard that name before. Elvan explains that Ajin are basically just like humans but not quite, and that includes everyone from beastmen to mermaids. Aruna asks if it's for real since that would make her an Ajan, but then Elden just starts sobbing out of nowhere. Elden throws himself at Diaz, crying his eyes out while asking if he and Aruna have a baby. But Diaz just asks why he's sobbing and tells him they don't have any kids. Aruna says she wants 10 kids, and Diaz just adopted 2 orphans she's sure Elden would call Jinn. Elden yelled at the top of his lungs that Diaz's wife and kids were actually Ajin, even calling Diaz his true soulmate. Out of nowhere, Elden's ears grow massive and he sprouts a trunk, using it to hoist DS into the air while Aruna and DS freak out because an adjunct shouldn't be able to do that. Back when Elden was just a kid, the royal capital started turning hero stories into massive stage plays to hype people up and get them to join the army. This was all news to him. The hero Diaz actually honored his parents' dying wish by taking down the powerful and protecting the weak. He literally used his fists to force those nobles to change their... The rich nobles hated this so much that they started shutting down shows after just a week before banning them for good. And man, the people were absolutely livid. People started passing around tablets filled with these crazy stories, and they even made it all the way to Kazdex, which is super far from the capital. The story he heard was mostly just made up, and it didn't say a single word about a noble being on the battlefield. Elton wasn't just going to believe the rumors, but from the tough veterans to the battlefield traitors, everyone who actually met Diaz couldn't stop hyping him up as a total legend. That's why he started looking up to Diaz. But then out of nowhere, Elden was told to stop pushing himself so hard. DS realized Elden had been lugging him around like a heavy chest, so it's no wonder he was completely drained after the whole squad worked so hard to find him. Diaz asks if Elden is really stuck, and the guy reveals he's a half Ajin, a rare mix of human and Ajin that has the crazy power to transform. His dad is an ex-feudal lord named Kazdex Enkus. His mom is Neha, a slave from the elephant race. Whenever his body transforms, he loses a ton of power. Elden's half-gene side gives him a huge edge, but his human half brings a ton of drama, especially since he's tiny for an elephant race but totally ripped for a human. His body is basically falling apart, and his wives are the only reason he's still standing. Then you've got Camelot, where the Asian are treated so horribly in Kastek that it's hard to even describe, and Elden is totally crushed just thinking about it. Elden dreamed of a world where every race lived in peace, so the Lord's son started using his power to secretly protect the assistant from the shadows. Diaz figured out those rumors about Elden loving women were just a big lie to keep the truth hidden. Arunas had one big question. Why didn't Enka enslave Elden like the rest of the Ajans? Even if he was his own son, being half Ajan usually. She asked if Enkus really wanted to enslave all the Ajin, and Kamlut confirmed that Elden would be treated like a servant, just like Neha. Inkas was married to a woman named Jania, and they already had an older son also named Jania, who looked just like his dad, and acted like a total jerk because of his ugly face. Enkus didn't care about Johnny since they looked the same, But when the handsome Elden was born in human form, he was totally hooked and claimed the kid was his son just to... Diaz realized this whole situation was just sick and twisted. He hated the kid who looked like him but liked the other one more, and it totally freaked him out that he couldn't feel any love at all. Elden had no clue he was actually an origin, and everyone else was kept in the dark too. Neha stayed right by his side, taking care of him as his loyal servant. But when right then, it finally clicked for Elden that Neha was actually his mom. After that, the two of them started getting way closer. Elden's only goal now was to build a real... heard whispers about a civil war and wondered if things were actually that crazy. But Camelot made it clear that Elden was only doing this to keep his friends safe. Jania and her crew snitched on their secret plans, making Enkus go ballistic and order the death of Elden, Neha, and every single Ajin, which is exactly why Elden. After a brutal war, Elden crushed Enkus and his crew, and even though he was a total fake, he took over as the new lord of the Kazdek's domain. Elden begged Diaz for forgiveness, pointing out that since he just married an Ajin he barely knew, his kids were totally going to be Ajin too. Aruna is living her absolute best life. He's totally sure her kids are going to grow up just as happy. But honestly, he had her all wrong when they first met. He thought they were... Diaz is totally down with Elden's dream too, especially since humans and Ajin already live in peace back in his village, and he thinks it'd be awesome if the whole world... So he's going to back them up and help out as much as possible, telling Elden that his dream is seriously next level. The guy thumps his chest and tells Elden to stand tall, asking him if he thinks being brave is actually a good thing. And that's when Elden finally pulls himself together. Diaz and Elden hung out for a bit before they started comparing how much food they both had stocked up in their territories. Elden walked up to Diaz and warned him that if they didn't find a way to store more food and boost production, the growing village was going to run out of supplies and be in. Winter was coming fast, so they had to start prepping right now. Diaz already warned them, and Lord Elden's orders made it even more urgent. He decides they're going to start by building a field for planting. Since he was a farmer before the war, he's ready to show off everything he knows. He needs to make a... Diaz and Aruna finally get back home to find Meimu, Senai, and Ikan waiting, but the girls immediately start screaming at Diaz for totally lying about coming back right away. He admitted it was all true, but even though he had a reason for being late, he knew anything he said would just sound like a total excuse. Senai and Ahen were finally passed out in bed, and Arunus was just shocked they had enough energy to play for that long. Diaz just thought these kids were running around way too much, and he was sure this whole peaceful village vibe was just a total act. I saw Sina eating her potatoes while she cried because Ahan wouldn't forgive her, and Diaz was just there trying to keep the peace. Diaz tried to trade his potatoes for peace, but she wasn't having it, making him realize their sisterly beef was way too intense to fix with food. Between all the crying and the wild stuff that happened overnight, even Aruna was totally shocked the next morning. Suddenly, the girls were burning up with a crazy fever, and after Aruna spent the whole night looking after them, Senai started crying for her mom, which made Aruna totally lose it and start sobbing too. Diaz figured all those rough days would actually help the girls grow, and once they survived the chaos, Sini and Ahan finally started acting nicer and smiling again. Aruna suddenly asks Diaz if they should just scold the girls this one time, but Diaz shuts it down because then they'd be the ones breaking their promise. Instead of getting mad, they should just apologize, because kids starting families naturally want to run around and check on the adults, and he thinks they should totally lean into that. She knows this is totally messing them up, so starting tomorrow, she's finally going to lay down the law and set them straight. Out of nowhere, Aruna sensed someone was creeping up on them. She warned everyone that a massive crowd was closing in from the southeast. Diaz asked if she was 100% sure these were. The girl says Elden already headed home a different way, but since it's late and that area is full of sketchy thugs, he probably got jumped by some thieves or bandits. Dia didn't care how dark it was and decided to head out anyway, telling Aruna to stay and guard the group, but she refused to be left behind. Arunus points out it's a pitch-black new moon, and without any help, there's no way DS can find them in the tall grass. Her magic should be enough as long as Klaus keeps an eye on the house, but suddenly, Klaus bolts awake because he hears someone calling his name. DS said he got the message, then told Aaron to follow him and hand over her power. The mercenary realized that rich Oni have so many Mimu heads they can just sit back and live off the money they bring in. He realized only the broke guys were out there hunting, and they had to scrape together a massive payment for a bride before they could even get married. He knew hunting bandits was the fastest way to make bank, but they almost never showed up in this area. This merc thinks it's totally weird to put in all this work for a field of empty grass, so he's sure these guys are hiding a secret plan. He whips around and asks if anyone actually lives in this place, pointing out there aren't even any trees nearby. This blonde guy walks right up to the man and tells him to shut his mouth. This dude claims he dropped a ton of cash on these mercenaries and warns them to stop yapping or they're giving every cent back. The guy throws his hands up and says he's on board, promising to handle everything perfectly, but he wonders why they have to wait until it's pitch black outside to pull this off. He asks the mercs if they've heard of the hero Diaz, warning them that this guy is a beast who wins head-on fights in broad daylight and could jump them at any second. The mercenary pulls a face, but the dude stays totally silent. He orders the mercs to take out a guy named Elden who's meeting Diaz in the meadows, but the mercenary wants to know exactly how much he's getting paid for the... This dude offers 100 silver for Elden and 10 whole gold coins for DS. The mercenary is totally blown away as he stares at the guy in pure shock. He grabs his torch and orders his crew to move out, shouting that catching Diaz is going to be their biggest payday yet. He tells them to finish the job so they can head back to the city. He spots a light heading straight for them, and the mercenary has no clue why this weird red glow is popping up in the dark. Out of nowhere, an arrow slams into one of the merc's shoulders, and he lets out a massive scream from the sudden sting. The guy is swearing his head off because the arrow hit Lyle, and he's fuming that his sneak attack got busted, so he points ahead and yells that the arrows are coming from that red light area. The mercenary leader screams for his guys to ditch their torches and start firing their bows, pointing straight at a glowing red light. That red light keeps on moving, but the moment it vanishes, the guy snaps into a fighting stance. Out of nowhere, an arrow slams right into a mercenary's leg. He lets out a brutal scream. Their leader starts panicking and demands to know where the shot even came from. The mercenary boss was totally blown away by how skilled this guy was. He couldn't wrap his head around how they even found his hiding spot. He really thought this was going to be an easy win. The guy screams at his crew to jump into the fight, telling them to keep their eyes glued to the target. The mercs start spraying bullets everywhere while their leader yells that if they can just find the enemy's hiding spot, they've totally got this. The mercs hear a voice coming from up ahead. Their leader just gets this huge, confident smirk. He points his sword forward and screams at his crew to grab the enemy while they have the chance. One merc barely finished asking where the enemy was before they all got slammed and sent flying across the field. The mercenary leader freezes in his tracks as the screams of his men fill the air, and he's totally shocked that his whole squad got wiped out in an instant. Realizing there's something, the mercenary leader brags that they've got way more guys, ordering his squad to get in formation and wait. His crew jumped in to help, but they got absolutely wrecked and sent flying all over the place. The mercenary leader caught a creepy green glow in the shadows. He stood there confused, trying to make sense of it. Then it clicked. It was definitely an agent. He started cussing. Suddenly, a massive dark figure pops up right in front of the mercenary, but he manages to throw his sword up just in time to block the hit. Sparks fly as their weapons clash, and the leader stares straight into his enemy's eyes to see who he's actually up against. That's when it finally clicked. The guy was actually Diaz. I saw those bright blue eyes, that thick armor, and a massive two-handed axe. Diaz kicks the guy, and as the mercenary leader starts swearing again, he realizes Diaz is worth way more than 100 gold coins. Meanwhile, the guy who hired Diaz is sprinting through the woods, desperately trying to find a place to hide. He's in total shock that his mercenaries got wiped out so easily. Now The kid bolts behind the tree and vanishes, but suddenly he feels something super weird and slams into the dirt, screaming and swearing his head off. The kid was absolutely fuming and blamed Diaz for every single thing that went wrong. He couldn't figure out why Diaz didn't just finish him off right away. There was no way. Ease tried to tell the torchmen to go on the attack, but they just kept swinging wildly until the fight was over. And even though an arrow nicked Aruna's face and the bandits were left in a total mess with some seriously nasty wounds, and while Diaz was fuming that one guy managed to slip away, the man decided he wasn't even worth the chase. Diaz and his squad snatched up the bandits' weapons, and after roasting them for being absolute idiots, he kicked them straight off the plains. Aruna was totally ticked off and thought just kicking them out was way too easy. But Diaz figured it was fine since nobody actually got hurt. Diaz warned the bandits that if they ever messed with his turf again, he was going to absolutely wreck them. Aruna says hunting bandits is actually a top-tier job. She's sure it's the best way to make a ton of money fast. She tells them they can grab a reward from... Diaz wondered if they could actually make some cash off those busted weapons. Diaz knew iron was basically a treasure out in the plains. Aruna's told him it wasn't just for cool weapons, but could be melted down into all kinds of useful tools. Aruna's family was pretty broke, so she decided her big dream was to hunt down bandits. Diaz looked at her and remembered that before they met, Arunim actually spent her days hunting and patrolling the wild plains just to survive. Diaz realized that hunting bandits was the absolute fastest way to stack some cash. The only problem was that bandits were super rare on these plains, so finding a big group was going to be tough. Suddenly, Aruna's horn starts glowing like crazy. She remembers her heart pounding as she felt Diaz's carriage getting closer. She totally thought bandits were finally attacking, but then she saw Diaz. Diaz realized Aruna could sense his every move, but she just figured Diaz was some weak refugee kicked out by the crew who wouldn't last a second out there. The next day, Aruna checked on Diaz during her patrol and found him totally passed out on the ground, looking so peaceful she was actually left speechless. Just to be safe, she decides to judge the soul, knowing that if it turns out blue, it's going to be a massive loss. Aruna tells Diaz that if he'd been left all alone, she wouldn't have been nice. She would have just swiped his armor and all his gear. Diaz was blown away that Aruna actually woke him up to talk, and honestly, she didn't even know why she felt the sudden urge to do it. Diaz ended up sticking with Aruna, and he's got zero regrets, even if they still have those days where they just don't get each other at all. Diaz kept his eyes locked on Aruna as she stared off into the distance. Aruna whips around with a bright red face and asks why she'd even want to date him, but Diaz just stares back totally clueless about what's going on. Right then she walks straight up to him and plants a kiss on his cheek. Diaz stared at her in total shock, while Aruna looked back feeling super awkward and shy. Aruna backed off and started walking the other way, but Diaz shouted out to her. The girl got super embarrassed and bolted, so Dia took off right after her. She stayed behind so she wouldn't leave him alone, and he was ready to sprint through the pitch-black night because he knew Aruna would lead the way. Diaz and Elden are chilling in the carriage when Elden mentions that growing their population is going to be a total grind, and they'll need a massive stash of food and gear to pull it off. Elden warns that if things go south, they'll run out of supplies in a heartbeat, so they need to gear up before winter hits. Diaz agreed that they had way bigger problems to deal with than just running out of food. Diaz realized that if the whole town was starving, Aruna and the kids were definitely going hungry too. Diaz steps up and promises to hunt even harder to make sure everyone has a massive pile of dried meat. Elden warns that eating the same boring food will totally wreck their health, so they need to grab some grain and any veggies they can find. DS looks at the massive meadow and asks the crew if they're ready to finally start farming the land. Elden asks Diaz if he's seriously planning to farm this land, warning him that it's basically impossible since everyone else failed and only grass can grow in this trash soil. Diaz says he's not giving up no matter how long it takes because they need to find out what's really going on. Elden finally gets it and promises to go all out to make sure Diaz comes out on top. Diaz snaps awake and his eyes fly open. He creeps out of the tent so he doesn't wake the girls and lets out a big stretch. Diaz walks up to Aruna by the well, and when he says hi, she totally blushes and greets him back. The old ladies nearby saw Aruna's huge smile and asked if something awesome happened last night. Klaus rushes over to Diaz and tells him he spotted a super weird monster while out on his morning patrol. Klaus holds up a bat and explains that a whole swarm jumped him, so he had to blast one down to make the rest of them scatter. Diaz says they're bats, but he's never seen anything this freaky before, and Klaus is just as clueless, so Diaz warns him to stay sharp, and Klaus knows he better listen. Diaz notices the sky is super clear, so the whole crew decides to have their breakfast outside. While they're eating, Diaz checks in with everyone to see if they need anything or if anyone is feeling. Diaz figured it was all thanks to Aruna's special healing herbs. They were using them every single day. They'd eat the herbs and even soak in medicinal baths to stay clean. Diaz turns to Aruna and asks where she's even getting all these medicinal herbs from. She says she finds some nearby and trades for others, but she mostly just grows them herself to get a massive supply. Dee asks if this means the tribe has massive fields of healing herbs back at the village. Aruna explains they grow their food in pots so they can take it with them, since they never know when they'll have to pack up and bail. Diaz wants to start farming in the meadow because he thinks a good harvest will finally bring them some peace, and he asks the guy if he's got the right idea. Diaz asks her to teach him how to grow medicinal herbs in pots, since he thinks she'd be perfect at making a guide for the farm. But Aruna says she's actually clueless and tells him he should just go talk to the chief instead. DS hits up the Oni chief, Shader Mogu, who tells him that farming in this spot is a total lost cause. Shader has no clue why nothing grows in these fields, but he says their ancestors had a secret trick that was lost forever during the war. Diaz tells Shader he should teach him how to grow those healing herbs since he's still totally down to give it a shot. Shader says it's actually super simple, so he just hands over a leaf fertilizer stone and promises that using it will make everything turn out great. This tin actually shows you exactly how to make those healing herbs and seeds. Diaz looks at the stones and can't figure out if it's a cultural thing or if they just care about different stuff. The chief says their fields are a total disaster, explaining that even when they tried growing beans and potatoes in pots, the plants would sprout leaves only to shrivel up and die. It looks like the forest people are definitely hiding something, so Diaz starts asking around to see what's up. The chief says these forest folks are total experts on nature, and he's heard they can turn a dry desert into a lush jungle with just a wave of their hand. But he's never seen anything this crazy before. One line out. The input is 1 block. I will provide 1 block. Final check on no complex metaphors. Turning this land green might be a metaphor. F. Diaz gives the lamb a pet and grins, saying he's totally down to spill the secret since he was going to show everyone his method anyway, and he even promises to bring a massive mountain of potatoes. The chief just smirks, saying he totally expected this from Diaz Blue, and tells him that everyone is rooting for his victory. The chief says he's hyped for Aruna and Diaz's baby to arrive and promises to hook them up with all the healing herbs they're gonna need. Diaz asks if this is really necessary, but the leader says it's way too valuable to pass up and agrees to give Aruna the medicine. Diaz thinks the whole plan is totally sketchy, so the leader starts trying to convince him they have no other choice. Diaz heads back to Klaus, and the guy is right there waiting for him. The girls spot them and sprint right over, totally hyped that Diaz is back so early, and he gives them a big smile, announcing that he's finally home. He drops down right in front of the girls, and when they ask about the bag he's holding, he pops it open to reveal it's full of sparkling jewels. He asks if the stones look awesome, but the girls are totally not impressed. The girls act like they're just totally average and bored, saying they don't even want something like that anyway. A bunch of rams were standing right there next to the girls. They all locked eyes for a second. Then the girls just bolted over to play with them. Aruna tracks down DS and asks what kind of rocks he's got, leaving him totally stunned since he thought they were actually beautiful. The rune reveals that if you look closely, these stones are actually totally empty of magic. Then she remembers that this guy can't feel a single drop of magic. She knew that any magic user could tell if a stone was enchanted just by looking at it. And even though these looked like shiny jewels, they didn't have any power at all and were basically just regular rocks. Diaz is totally blown away by how much Aruna knows, and when he asks if Senai and Ikin can spot different stones too, Aruna says they're actually geniuses for their age. Diaz looks at the girls and smiles, thinking about how insane their talent really is. He was certain these kids would have a massive future no matter what, knowing they'd become legendary mages one day. But then the girls suddenly shrieked that someone was closing in. They yelled for everyone to gear up and get ready to fight back. A massive swarm of bats comes zooming straight for the tribe. Diaz whips out his gun and tells Aruna and the kids to hide in the yurt, and they all bolt forward with Klaus. Klaus figured these morning bats were back for some serious payback for their fallen bro. But man, they were way too small, and there were just too many of them to hit. He realized right then that Diaz charged straight ahead and started taking out those bats. Klaus jumped in to help, and they spent forever swinging their weapons until every single bat was wiped out. One of the bats zoomed right at Diaz and snatched the axe with its teeth, and that's when he realized he was looking at the leader of the pack. Klaus sprinted over to Diaz and clocked the pack boss, and then they both went right back to smashing those bats. Those bats were moving way too fast, but Klaus and Aruna screamed at Diaz to keep on fighting. He swung his axe with everything he had and slammed it right into the pack leader. Aruna explains these Mekakushi bots hunt by sound, so they have to scream their heads off to win, and DS just smiles because she totally saved their lives. He admits the screen totally freaked him out, so Aruna apologizes for being sloppy since the big ones usually stay away, while Diaz starts asking what's up with the monsters. The girl stays quiet and just stares at him, so Dia flashes a grin and apologizes, saying his ears are still acting up. Aruna smirks and leans in to whisper something in Diaz's ear, leaving him looking at her in total shock. While the guy tried to get Runa to say that again, Klaus was already flat on the ground, totally knocked out. Diaz smashes the stones and reaches into the bowl to see if he actually turned them into dust. Diaz finally kicks back with a huge sigh of relief because after 5 straight days of grinding those fertilizer stones from the chief, he's finally finished and knows they can finally start farming the fields. Diaz knew he had to clear the field and plow the ground first, but then Aruna suddenly called out to him. Diaz spun around right as the girl yelled that someone was closing in from the east. Diaz and Aruna headed toward the visitors, but Diaz was totally focused on Aruna's warning. She sensed a bunch of people on horses, but also something else that definitely wasn't a person. Diaz was ready to go check it out, but Aruna stopped him, refusing to let him go solo until they figured out who was heading their way. Diaz figured he'd feel way better with Aruna by his side, and as she yells that they're about to see who's coming, he whips out his binoculars to get a... His eyes pop when he recognizes Camelos, and he quickly warns Aruna that Elden's servant is headed straight for them. The girl tells the guy to stop overhyping things if he actually knows him. Diaz whips around to see what's behind him. He spots these mysterious white animals. Then he realizes they're actually a pack of buffalo. He notices a bunch of servants and luggage following. Diaz recognizes the white beast that looks just like a black buffalo and thinks the name is actually pretty easy to remember. Aruna takes a super close look at the carts. Then she mentions seeing a tiny shadow moving around in the second cart's bags. She thinks this little creature is spying on everything happening outside. Right now, a bunch of tiny mice are bouncing all over the cart. The one wearing glasses is flashing back to the moment they got busted while hunting. They managed to sneak into this cart heading. This mouse with glasses was just trying to snag some beans, but when another mouse asked what she was up to, she totally freaked out. The mouse with glasses decides to grab some snacks, but the other mouse warns her it's just gonna slow them down. The mouse with glasses nervously asks how they're gonna survive this long trip without any snacks. They have no clue when they'll finally get off the cart to find a meal. She promises him. Mouse asks Emma if she's really missed the fact that they're heading west instead of south toward the desert, saying that since Emma is actually pretty smart, she should have realized their real plan is to take down Diaz. Mouse promises to take down Diaz, show off their true power, and finally bring back the pride of the desert people. Emma is totally shocked. She only shared her genius plan with the group because she was desperate to get back to the desert. She only played along because she was ordered to figure out how to sneak onto. Emma points out that since he crushed the dragon, he's way stronger than it, and she convinces the whole group that they don't stand a chance against DS. They all started bragging about being a powerful desert clan and trashing humans, deciding that taking down Diaz was the right move. The mice trick Emma into thinking they're the ones in charge, remembering the guy who told them to head back to the desert with a bunch of food. The card freezes up, making me look like a total fraud, and now Diaz is walking right up to it. He greets them and says thanks for meeting up, but when Kamalos mentions Elden's delivery is finally here, the mice get absolutely furious. DS is hyped that Kamalos finally showed up, apologizing for the rush because he's got a burning question, while one of the mice tries to bail from the cart until Emma stops it, warning that this enemy is way too strong for them to handle. Emma shoves the mouse away and wipes out, but then Diaz hears a creepy noise coming from the bags and asks if something's hiding in there. Out of nowhere, mice leap from the cart to jump Diaz because they think he's an easy target, and he's totally shocked when the little guys actually start talking. Aruna whips out her weapon and sends every single mouse running for cover. Diaz stares at the girl in total shock as she calls him out for being way too reckless, so he asks if she's actually questioning his skills, but Aruna stops them, saying they can. The mice swarm Diaz again and start trash-talking Aruna, but he points his axe at them and yells that she's actually amazing, refusing to let that insult slide while Aruna turns bright. Kamalos freaks out seeing mice in the cart, but he's even more shocked when they actually start talking, so he orders his men to grab every single one of them. Every single mouse was actually a cotton bag, and they were all trying to bolt while screaming curses at the entire human race. Camelo bowed and apologized to Diaz, trying to be super formal about it, but Diaz just told him he didn't need to say sorry. Kamalo says these mice are actually a tribe on their own land, so he's not going anywhere until he apologizes, which totally shocks Diaz as he realizes they're basically just like beastmen. Kamalos broke down the truth about the beastmen, explaining that they actually have their own culture and can totally talk. Final check. One line? Yes. Simple? Yes. No fluff? Yes. Accurate? Yes. Kamalis explains that these mice are part of a long-eared jumping tribe who call the desert their home. DS is totally shocked to find a desert in Elden's land, especially since he's never even heard of a kingdom made of sand before. Kamalots keeps going, explaining how Mage calls the desert their true home before revealing exactly where they're hiding out. Diaz gets super serious thinking they've run into a slave hunter, while the mice keep jumping into bags and screaming their heads off. DS thought Elden promised to save them and give their desert back, but they didn't trust him at all, even though he was a total hero who did everything to keep his clan safe. Kamalas explains that now that Elden is a powerful lord, he's promised to give the mice their homeland back. Aruna points out that Camelot used to be white but is totally blue now, so she thinks they should just let him off the hook for free since he's changed. Suddenly she remembers the mice were bright red and warns that next time, they won't be playing nice at all. Kamalos stares Diaz down, but Diaz just smirks and tells him he doesn't need to apologize for that mess, though he'll still take it even if Kamalos is being stubborn. Diaz says these mice are totally unhinged and warns they won't be holding back next time. He decides to just give those mice a warning and let Camelots handle the dirty work, while Camelots just grins and follows orders. He's got DS on his mind, and now both are. A beastman walks up to Camelotson to say the search is over, but he admits his nose is totally useless because the cargo is packed with way too much spice. Camelot says he gets it and goes to check the cargo, personally searching every single cart, but he finds absolutely nothing weird, so the inspection is finally over. Those mice were dragged back to Elden to get grilled about why they jumped Diaz, and they're definitely gonna pay for what they did. Diaz turns to Camelot and starts asking him all about the spices and how they're going to move those household tools. Camalo says he totally forgot to tell Diaz because it was so loud, but all the gear is ready, so he hands over an envelope and tells him to check out the spices. The note said Elden would hook him up with more tools if he was running low, and he really hoped Diaz liked the spices he sent along. Elden finishes up by talking about their future trade deals and their last talk, while the guy wishes him luck and says he can't wait for their next meeting. The end of the letter said all this stuff was a total gift to prove their friendship, so Diaz didn't have to pay a single cent. Kamalis walks up to Diaz and tells him Elden finally sent over the building supplies for the stables, leaving Diaz totally shocked. Kamalos's crew told Diaz to relax because they were only there to work on the construction. Diaz was starting to feel super guilty because he'd taken so many gifts without giving a single thing back. Kamalos asks Diaz if he wants to take the reins, telling him the whole horse and cart belong to him now, while Aruna looks at the animals in total awe. Kamala keeps hyping up the horses, saying that with the coachman's help, Diaz will be able to handle them perfectly right away. Aruna walks right up to Diaz to ask if it's all real, and he straight up tells her it's the truth. The guy doesn't even get a chance to speak before Aruna sprints over to the horse, totally hyped that they finally scored some rides. Diaz had no clue that horses were the main way this tribe got around. The guy claimed that owning a ton of horses showed you were rich and brave, but Arun's family was way too broke to ever afford that. ES looked at her and wondered if Aruna had ever spent a single second not stressing over her family. Aruna spins around and tells him she's dreamed of being a horse-riding warrior since she was a little kid. And since she can't believe Diaz got them horses so fast, she just tackles him with a massive hug before he can even say a word. She thanked Diaz and said she'd handle the horses, but even when he asked if Aruna was okay, she just wouldn't stop hugging him. Ima sat in the cart thinking she was totally done for and about to get caught, but when she tried to scramble out, something was completely blocking her path. The mouse is totally desperate, begging for anyone to come and save her. The sister rushes over to check out the tea leaves and promises to share them with her. The girl realizes the seeds in the tea are the exact same thing. Her sister totally agrees, and they both suddenly remember their parents were huge tea fans too. True Cheese's grandma tells Diaz to grip those reins tight, but he says Buffalo is already a pro at farm work, so she just nods and keeps moving. He starts working the field with the plow and is totally blown away by how fast the job is getting done. After grinding for hours, Diaz finally calls it quits for a bit. Chiruchi tells him they need to leave the land alone for a few days. She thinks they should wait 3 whole days before getting back. Chiruchi wants to see if anything will actually grow in the field this time, so she tells them to start digging a massive water reservoir while they wait. Diaz asks about the reservoir, and Grandma breaks down exactly how the village's water system works. Grandma asks if Diaz has the reservoir all figured out, and when he says he's ready to build it, she totally hypes him up. The girls rush over to Diaz to see if he's done with the fields, but he tells them he's still working and wonders what they're really after. The girls froze for a second, but then they told the guy he had to leave because Aruna was already busy making dinner. Diaz is super hyped and thanks the girls for the invite, but then he notices their faces have totally dropped. The guy scoops up the girls to see what's wrong, and they just ask if DS is having a hard time plowing the fields. The guy says it's a piece of cake, but when a girl asks if Diaz will be mad if the field fails, he just shrugs and says it's not a big deal. She looks up at Diaz with sad eyes and asks if he'd be mad if he found out they were hiding something from him. He stares at her for a second and says there's no way he's getting mad, since everyone has their own little secrets anyway. The girl gives a shaky smile, leaving Diaz totally confused about what just went down. The girls hit the ground and scramble away, leaving the guy standing there totally clueless about what just happened. The guy was totally stressing and kept bugging the girls for the secret, but they wouldn't say a single word. Arona was totally clueless about the girl's secret, and even though the whole village tried to get them to talk, they wouldn't say a single word. Diaz was totally freaking out about what went down, but even after watching them like a hawk, he couldn't find anything suspicious. He figured kids that age are just weirdos sometimes, so he totally brushed it off and moved on. Aruna told him 3 days were up and he could finally start planting, so she handed him the seeds and explained their crazy effects. She figured the seeds were just a test to see if the field actually worked, and the guy thanked her for it. Diaz was sure the fertilizer would make those seeds sprout in a flash, and he was totally hyped to see it happen. Klaus heads over to Diaz and tells him that Kamalos' crew finally finished building the stable. Diaz was totally shocked that Kamalos and his crew managed to build a whole stable that fast. Diaz found out the stables were built in a flash using pre-made parts that just needed to be snapped together right there. Diaz thanks Camelos, while the guy claims he was just following Elden's orders. S says this isn't just a payment, it's a gift from the heart, so he points to the side and tells Camelos he's gotta accept it. Camelos asks what the gear is made of, and when Diaz reveals it's actually Earth Dragon parts, everyone loses it, so Camelos tries to turn it down because it's way too. A servant asks Diaz what he's really up to, but he just gives a sneaky smile and apologizes, so Camelos and his crew decide to just hold on to the gifts for safekeeping. The next morning, Camelos announces it's time to hit the road. Diaz gives the guy a quick thanks for everything he did. Aruna just watches from the side while all the crying girls hang. Diaz remembers how the girls were super shy around Camelos at first, but since they eventually got used to him, they're totally heartbroken now. Aruna tells the girls to dry their eyes because they've still got horses to look after later. Arun warns the girls to hurry up, or those horses are gonna start crying and get super hungry and thirsty. Diaz checks out the field to see how things are holding up, but he's shocked to find that all the little sprouts have already shriveled up. Aruna walks up to Diaz, and he just smirks, admitting he didn't think she'd actually pull it off before offering to start the whole process over. The next day, the new crops shriveled up too, so Aruna went right back to find the guy. He looked back and figured he needed way more fertilizer, so he decided to toss in a little extra. The next day, the guy dumped even more fertilizer on the dirt, but nothing grew, so Aruna went back to talk to him. Diaz realized he was low on fertilizer again, so he decided to seriously crank up the amount. He kept doing the same thing, but the plants still wouldn't grow, so when Aruna tried to help Diaz again, the guy just made a face and stood up. Diaz was still debating if he should toss in more rock fertilizer. Aruna literally grabbed his hand and told him to just stop. She just wanted him to finally take a break and get some rest. Aruna says there's no way you can mix that much rock fertilizer with leaves, and she's totally convinced that farming in these meadows is just impossible. Diaz agrees that some seeds just never grow, so he decides to move on and focus on his other goals. Diaz and Runa head back home while the girls watch them go, totally lost on what to do next, but it's obvious she really wants to help Diaz out. She's totally stuck, but right then she pulls out a tiny glass jar. Out of nowhere, the girls hear a weird noise, and after asking her sister if she heard that creepy voice calling for help, they decide to go see what's going on. Inside one of the huts, Ima was screaming her lungs out for help, guessing it had been a whole week since she'd had a single drop of water. Ima's totally regretting not asking Diaz for help with that box, and the second the girls step into the hut, they end up spooking a tiny mouse. The girls call out to see if anyone's hiding inside. Ima screams at the top of her lungs for help. That's when the girls realize they were right all along. Ima asks if everyone's okay, thinking the girls are coming to her rescue, while the guy tells them to stop playing hero and just go find an adult. The girls tell him all the adults are busy, so Ima begs him to just listen to her. He says he can hang out a bit longer while the girls shout they're almost finished. They toss. The mouse yells out that the girl totally saved him, thanking the group and admitting that things were getting really rough. The girls introduce themselves to the mouse and they're totally hyped to see him. The girls start hyping Amy up, and the little mouse actually gives them a big thank you. Ima introduces herself right back and starts telling them all about where she's from. Aruna spots Diaz still grinding away in the field and tells him to quit, but he's convinced he's finally gonna pull it off, making her scream that he looks like a... The girls were scratching their heads over why AIMA was locked in that box, thinking he must have done something seriously bad to get tossed in there. She screams that she's totally innocent and starts explaining exactly how she ended up trapped in that box. The girls start grilling Ima about her feelings for Diaz, but she swears she's never even talked to him, and they aren't friends, leaving the group to trade some seriously suspicious looks. They decide to hit up Emma and tell her they've been keeping a massive secret. Emma demanded to know what secret the girls were keeping. She figured there had to be someone better for the job, but the girl told her that absolutely nobody in the village could do it. The girls are gossiping about how Diaz grinds in the fields every single day, but he's still having zero luck. The girls say the Earth is totally out of power, making DS's moves useless, and even though they can fix the world's glitches, they can't do it for just one person. The girls suddenly remember their parents' warning about their insane forest-shaping abilities. Their folks were terrified that people would just use and abuse that power if they ever found out. They were told to make... The girls really wanted to back Diaz up, and since Ima wasn't even human, they felt safe spilling all the tea. They asked her what they should do next, but Ima needed to... Ima tells the girls to hold up and asks them what race they even are. The girls reveal they actually live in the woods, spending their time guarding the forest and learning all its secrets. Ima starts remembering everything she knows about the forest people, like how they pour all their power and wisdom into a seed right before they die. The girls explain how they plant seeds in super important spots. Right before they die, The forest people give their seeds to someone they love to start a new forest. The person who gets the... I realized the girls had two insane powers, one to make plants grow super fast, and another to create massive shields. And even the mouse knew they were meant to protect the forest. Ima asks if she's still cut out to be an assistant, but the girls tell her she's definitely staying since she's the brains of the group. Ima realized the girls were still too young to grow a whole forest, but they could still wrap the woods in a small shield. She knew that if they kept going, the trees would start. The mouse just couldn't figure out why these girls were even living with Diaz, especially since she thought staying away from humans was way better. The girls admitted they were terrified of him at first, and the girls all say Diaz is the nicest guy ever, way kinder than anyone else in the entire village. They're actually thinking about spilling the big secret to him because they're betting on the fact that he won't go crazy with all that power. But Ima can tell the girls are totally... The girls realize this spot is literally sucking up all the Earth's energy, and while they're breaking down how it works, Ima says they need to figure out what's really... The girls just shrug and say they have no clue. The girls realize this kid isn't actually bad, but they're still worried about how dangerous this stretching stuff can get. Ima is finally starting to wrap her head around how the whole stretching process works. She's got a hunch that someone is actually causing. Mouse asks if they can use their powers on the low, but the girls say Diaz is always watching, and they're way too tired to wake up and sneak around at night. The mouse offers to wake them up since he's got crazy good night vision, and he says he'll help them get back home if they just tell him where it is. The girls are so relieved they finally talked it out, and Ima knows for sure that listening to her story was totally worth it. Ima tells the girls to chill out and make a plan right now, because if they don't, they're totally gonna get caught. The girls just wouldn't slow down, but Ama was already starting to get a really bad feeling about this. Once it gets dark, Ima goes looking for the girls' hut and spots a hole in the wall to sneak right in. The mouse spots Diaz and totally panics. Then he accidentally sneezes, but Diaz stays fast asleep, and the little guy realizes that was a super close call. The mouse finds the twins and tries to wake them up so they can get to the field, but even though they open their eyes, they just fall right back asleep. The girls finally wake up and head outside, but Ima sees how shaken they are and asks what's wrong, so they admit they're just freezing and terrified. Mouse asks how they even managed to use the bathroom in the pitch black, and the girls explain that Diaz and Aruna always went with them for backup. The girl steps forward and pulls out the seeds her parents left behind. The girls just smile and say their parents' seeds keep them happy, so they carry them everywhere, and Aim finally gets it. They finally reached the field and told the mouse to stay behind while Ima stared at the crazy zone Diaz had built. The girls whipped out the seeds and faced off, immediately starting to chant their magic spells. They saw the seeds float up and start sparkling like crazy, and Emma was totally blown away. The girls shared a hyped look and kept firing off spells as a massive glow suddenly exploded all around them. Just like that, he vanished again, and while the girls kept blasting magic, Ima was just trying to figure out what they were even saying. The girls say the barrier is holding up great, but they're already rubbing their eyes and saying they're ready to pass out. The mouse asks if the barrier is finally finished, sees the girls are totally wiped out and heading home, and realizes her job is officially over. The girls headed back to bed and knocked out instantly. They were even mumbling random things in their sleep. That little mouse was just lying there right between them. She kept begging them to let her. Morning hits the city of Melangal in the Kazdex region, and inside a local tavern, a serious talk is already going down. Everyone was freaking out that Elden headed to the royal capital, especially since he took the magic stone with him. One visitor promises that this magic stone will give him happy memories, and he's convinced it'll make the whole Kazdex territory way more peaceful. Another guy points out that humans usually stay away from half-humans, and he's totally convinced Elden is up to something shady. Word spread through the tavern that the Dragon Slayer actually married a demi-human, and that they're totally in love, but everyone also knew he came from the East where people are famous for hating other. The visitors were gossiping about how the Dragon Slayer's wife was the first human he ever met, thinking Diaz fell for her and then other half-humans, and they laughed because even... One visitor explains that the Dragon Slayer and Elden are only friends because of the Slayer's wife, making the half-beast ask what race she is, and another guy adds that while this half-beast visitor thinks she's a rhino and assumes humans have totally fallen for the rhino race. A deer-looking guy asks his friends if they've spotted the sign the Dragon Slayer put up to find new people to live there. One of the visitors recognizes the sign and remembers exactly what it said, mentioning that a bunch of dog people were actually super interested in it. They start talking about the jumping mice attack, and he reveals it was all a setup by a mastermind who actually controlled the mice and made them strike. Nobody there had ever heard of this race of 8 men, so they all thought it was a total scam, and that some random guys were just faking it on the property. One customer describes a tall guy with a black cloth over his face, and just as everyone's tripping over how the mice could trust someone so sketchy, they suddenly spot him standing right there. This guy in the black cloak has no clue what the beastmen are saying, and he thinks they're so dumb he can just trick them. But even when he flashes a ton of... This shady guy only managed to trick a bunch of mice, but he didn't care about them because he was still ready to take down Diaz. A couple of knights were gossiping about everyone ditching Diana's squad since they could tell her group was totally cooked, especially after hearing the Maze faction lost Duke Kazdex in his western trade zone. The knights were busy breaking down who Richard and Isabella were teaming up with, all while trying to uncover the dark secrets of the royal family's bloodline. The knights are totally on edge because everything is about to flip, especially since the king's second son is apparently besties with Diaz, and keeps bragging about how close they are. Word got out to the knight that DS is officially the new lord of Neutros Meadows. The second knight had been hearing all sorts of crazy stuff about those lands. He was totally obsessed with the rumors of... Out of nowhere, the commander rushes over to the knights and shouts that Diana just took off with a massive army past the capital, but the knights are just confused why he's freaking out. The big boss says Diana just took off with a massive army and a ton of supplies, and he's totally convinced the war is starting all over again. The knight told them to just ignore it, since someone else was going to handle the mess anyway. Aruna snaps awake and spots the girls looking totally decked out in their outfits. She leans in for a better look and spots a tiny mouse actually wishing her a good morning. Arunus lets out a terrified scream that snaps Diaz wide awake. The morning was already a total disaster with so much going down. You could just feel how tense and weird the vibe was. Then it turns out the twins were actually sleeping with a literal mouse. Nobody understood. Jalant rushes toward Diaz, and suddenly, the guy finally understands what caused those crazy screams from earlier. He was terrified they'd get attacked again because he thought Emo was bright blue, but Aruna told him to just chill out. Jalant tilts her head and asks about the color, but DS just tells her to drop it. The seeds he planted that evening sprouted instantly, and just as Diaz thought it was normal, he noticed a perfect circle in the field. He realized the chemicals in his dirt were way different from the ones in his grandma's field. He couldn't wrap his head around why they weren't the same. Jalant cracks up and says the story is totally wild, then points out how those birds in the field are making a huge racket. Diaz asks if Jalant can actually talk to birds, but she just laughs and says there's no way, which totally kills his vibe. Diaz thinks back to the third time the twins trashed the warehouse, and even though he cleaned it all up, he was still stressing over some beans that spilled out of a chest while Diaz realized that a bird stopping by was actually the most exciting thing to happen to him all day. He remembers grabbing his beans and bumping into Jalant of the pigeon people, which totally terrified him, especially when Jalant demanded to know why everyone was making so much noise. Jalant finally remembers his mission. He's got to deliver Elden's letter, and Diaz is the one who needs to sign off on it. Diaz is totally lost at first, but then he reaches down and rips open the bag to find 3 letters inside. The first is a big apology. The second is a massive warning about some sketchy... Diaz looks up and asks Jalant what a little species even is, since he's completely clueless. Jalant explains that the dog people actually come in 2 sizes, big and small. He goes over all the ways they're different from each other. He says the little ones are basically 1 line out. Rule again. If the input is a paragraph, should I treat it as 1 line or 4? Usually in these prompts, line refers to the block provided. Diaz walks up to Klaus to ask what he thinks about dog people. And since Klaus is totally cool with them, it turns out the rest of the crew doesn't mind either. Diaz went to talk to Aruna, but she was still busy chewing out the girls for that mouse in the bed. The girls were totally hyped when they heard the news. Aruna says the vibe is way too crazy to keep teaching, and Diaz asks if the girls have said anything yet. Aruna says the girls are definitely reflecting on what they did, but it's not like the twins are talking anyway. Diaz thinks they're definitely hiding something, but since he's sure they aren't actually evil, he tells everyone to just wait and see while Aruna smiles and agrees. Diaz spots a mouse lurking right behind the girls, and remembering Arun's soul assessment, he's totally confused how they even became friends with a creature like that. Diaz kneels down to ask Amma how he even got here, but Mouse tells him it's a seriously long story. Diaz zips up the pigeon's bag and lets it loose, sending Jalant zooming into the sky. He zoomed off with a letter Diaz just finished writing. He's only got 1 day to get that thing delivered. Inside, Diaz spilled everything about Amy and how those human dogs are. Ema hopped onto Diaz's shoulder and told him she was totally counting on him, and Diaz just grinned, feeling so stoked that she was finally moving into the village with them. Ema spilled the whole story. Once she finished, she dropped the news that she was moving to Iluk village. Diaz asked her why, and she said she just wanted to be near the Ima told him she could read and write and even teach the other girls, begging him to let her stay because she was totally dead set on it. Diaz introduced Ima to the whole squad to see what they thought, and while everyone else was cool with it, Aruna looked totally annoyed. The mouse begged Aruna to help her blend in with all the other mice. Aruna finally said okay, but she had some major rules first. And just like that, Ima was officially part of. He scanned the warehouse and noticed some of the gear was gone, but he was really hunting for a missing barrel of wine. Ima heard that wine barrel was actually for a welcome party, so she tells everyone they need to go check it out right now. Diaz stepped out of the warehouse and saw the wine barrel was already at the hall, all set for the big welcoming party. Ima asks the grandmas what they're up to, and Diaz guesses they're making something sweet with sugar. Suddenly, the mouse shrieks and leaps off Diaz's shoulder, begging the. Diaz was totally lost as everyone started holiday prep, so Aruna spotted his confused face and headed his way. She asks if he's shocked, and he's like, yeah, totally, wondering how they even had time to set all this up. The girl claims Diaz was just busy, smiling as she says they started getting ready while he was writing a letter, and then the two of them just lock eyes. She calls out Diaz for hiding the wine without asking her, making Aruna wonder if he's breaking the law, especially since Diaz was just worried everyone would get addicted. He didn't know the village rules, but since Aruna just turned 15, he got worried about her and stashed the wine away. Aruna just smiles and says she isn't mad at all since Diaz did it all for her, and honestly, she figured out what was really going on a long time ago. She looks him right in the eye and says it was just a little payback, telling Diaz he needs to talk to her more since they're literally husband and wife. Aruna turns bright red and admits these moments actually make her pretty sad, so she begs Diaz to finally tell her the whole truth. Aruna points out they're literally married and should get to know each other, so Diaz says sorry and promises to listen, but then he just starts geeking out about wine. She gives him a terrifying glare and shuts him down, insisting he's talking crazy and that wine is actually super healthy. Aruna explains this wild horse milk wine and how families give it to little kids who just stopped nursing. Diaz flips out, shouting that you can't give a baby wine because it's totally messed up. Aruna totally loses it and calls them out on their lies, finally telling everyone what she really went through. Grandma gives Diaz a quick smack on the back, and the guy asks what's going on. Grandma says Diaz and Aruna vibe perfectly, so she tells them to get to work on the party prep. He tried to make an excuse, but his grandma shut him down and told him they found a whole barrel of wine to party with. Diaz was totally shocked that Aruna only cared about the wine running out after the dogman showed up, and he honestly thought she was a lost cause. Diaz just smiles at her, realizing this was Aruna's real plan all along, and since he felt bad for keeping her in the dark, he decides to just stay quiet. New tribes are constantly showing up in Iluk, so the Aztec decided to lay down his own rules to keep things from getting crazy. Diaz knew that as the Lord, he had to be the one to step up and keep his village safe from any enemies. The party finally wrapped up the next morning, but breakfast came with a super weird drink called cummies. After remembering what DS said about alcohol, the girl decided to take the new brew to all the nearby villages to show it off. Diaz is confused why she's drinking so early, but she tells him to try it, and one sip of that kumis actually blows his mind. He asks if it's really alcohol, but Grandma says he'd have to drink a ton of it to even get a buzz. Diaz noticed the drink was barely strong at all, so he figured it was totally fine to let the kid have a tiny sip. Adruna starts bragging about how great kumis is, and Diaz realizes she thinks it's actual booze, so she just plays along. But since he's used to way stronger drinks, Diaz realized they had to talk this out because everyone had their own history and way of doing things. Diaz noticed the vibe spreading to everyone in town, and pretty soon, the whole village was talking up a storm. Diaz and the grandma were just busy planting seeds when the twins suddenly sprinted over to show off a massive haul of yamoshi, and Diaz made sure to thank them. The girls all volunteered to work the fields, and the guy was totally down to let them do it. Diaz flashes a grin and says he's gonna start a little farm next time, but since going too far is way too dangerous, he'll keep it right by the horses, and the girls are super grateful. Diaz turns around to thank the grandmas for their hard work, and they give him a big thanks right back. The guy stopped right in front of Grandma Celia because she had something she really needed to tell him. That night, everyone met up to talk about Grandma Celia's big plan, and she straight up told them they didn't need to ask the rest of the village for their opinion. She thinks everyone is just mindlessly following Diaz, and warns they need a real plan for when people start clashing. Grandma told them to pick some brave reps to gather everyone's ideas and bring them straight to Diaz. And since everyone was on board, they kept the meeting moving. The whole group sat down and went over every single detail of the rules. Diaz was the one who called the shots. Aruna started giving everyone tips on how to look after the place. Grandma Maya steps up to speak for her whole group and lets everyone know exactly what they're thinking. Klaus is the big military commander running the territory, and the reps have to gather everyone's thoughts so they can speak up at the big meetings. Since IMA is actually educated, she decided to step up and be the voice for the Beastmen group. Diaz and the whole village agreed to play by the rules, so now the dog people had to step up and pick their own leader too. The meeting dragged on way past midnight until they finally made some massive decisions. Aruna shakes Diaz awake to tell him they've got company, and he's just wondering why they're showing up at the crack of dawn. She was totally passed out and didn't even see the guests until they were right at the village, but she promised to explain the whole story while they're on the move. She figured they were some kind of dog people when she saw a whole pack of them in all different sizes. He's already figured out who it is, but she's still totally clueless, and just as she's about to say something, she screams because someone is standing right in front of them. Aruna and Diaz were totally shocked to see a giant anaconda lunging at the dog people right as they were trying to make a run for it. The anaconda swung its mouth wide open, and while Diaz was demanding to know what was happening, Aruna was still just trying to process the whole situation. The girl screams that it's an anaconda, but Diaz is totally confused since he didn't know they brought a monster, and she yells that the giant snake is literally chasing them down. R&R realizes she totally forgot her bow and arrows at home, and just as the anaconda is about to strike its victims, Diaz and the others can only watch in pure horror. She snatches one of those dogmen while they're all screaming for their lives, and the guy just charges straight into the action. Aruna screamed at him to stop, totally freaking out because they didn't have any weapons to defend themselves. The anaconda lunged with its jaws wide open, but Diaz will shut it down with a massive hit. The deviation lunged forward, trying to snatch her up. The snake started squirming like crazy, but Diaz gripped it even tighter and finally took it down. Aruna rushes over and calls him out for being way too reckless, and the guy just says he's sorry. The dog squad rushes up to the giant anaconda and shouts to see if their friend is all right. Then suddenly a guy pops out of the snake's mouth saying he's still alive. Aruna is totally freaking out because she forgot her bow and arrows, and she swears she'll never make a mistake like that ever again. One guest thanks Diaz for the save, explains the whole situation, and asks for their names, so Diaz and Aruna finally introduce themselves. She says her name is Canis, and explains that Elden put her in charge of leading and protecting a bunch of tiny creatures. Canis explains who's being picked for resettlement and points her finger straight at the Blackford T-Bay Musty. Next, she brings up the brown-haired Basenji, and then finishes things off with the black-haired Osunshipu. Kenna explains that having a clan name is actually a huge deal. Right then, Aruno is right in the middle of his soul assessment. She heads over to Diaz to let him know the test is... Canis remembers the little species were looking for jobs, so she asks Diaz if he can give them some work. The dog people stare at Diaz with pleading eyes as the man starts explaining exactly where they need more help. EAS tells the dog people they can finally start working, promising he's got a job ready for every single one of them. The dog people start jumping around like crazy, but when he tells them to chill, they all listen to him instantly, and Diaz definitely catches on to what's happening. Diaz leans down while Aruna keeps her eyes locked on him, and as Kini stands there totally shocked, Diaz reintroduces himself and says he's happy to meet them. Canis is stunned that they're talking eye to eye just like human dogs, and she starts thinking Diaz is one weird dude. The dogs all line up and start introducing themselves. The Mastai clan chief introduced himself and reached out a paw, so Diaz shook it and told him he was hyped to meet him. The clan chief, Sedoreo Bar Senji, introduced himself and explained how they'd help the village. Then Diaz shook his paw and pointed out who else was ready to jump in. Diaz turns around to see another dogman rushing up to introduce himself as the chief of the Raihato Goda Funyadasef Osunshepu clan, and since they want to look after the... Aruna and DS flash a smile as the guy finally agrees to trust them with all his horses and sheep. DS looks over and spots Aruna starting to say hi and introduce herself to everyone. The dog people were totally questioning if Aruna was really Diaz's wife since she was so young and pretty, but she just flashed them a smile. The Valve leaders gave their big reports while weaving through the massive crowd to say hey to all the guests. Kines looks over at Diaz and asks if he's actually serious about turning these little guys into soldiers. She told them to just stick to the easy jobs since they were way too weak for anything else. Diaz realizes he's heard about this before, and he can totally see that Canis is freaking out. Diaz walks up to Klaus with Canis and Aruna to thank him for the patrol, and Klaus thanks him right back while asking who his new friends are. Diaz introduces the guests, Klaus gives Canis a shout-out, and the girl says hey to the guy too. They just stood there staring in total awe of each other. But suddenly, they both felt a really weird vibe in the air. Aruna figured it out in a heartbeat, but DS was just standing there completely clueless. The dog people asked the grandmas what the plan was, and a few of them tagged along with Senai and Aiken to gather stones. Diaz realized the stones were basically superpowered fertilizer, which is exactly how the plants grew such deep roots and got so big. Diaz watched the dog people working hard by the well, thinking about how it's already been 10 whole days since they first showed up. Diaz figured their parents must have taught them how to use stones, so the girls remembered those lessons and got straight to work in the fields. Diaz whipped around at the noise and saw a bunch of dog people heading to work looking totally hyped. Diaz realized the dog people weren't actually clumsy like everyone feared, so he just whipped up some perfect tools for them. Cloud screamed for the squad to group up right now. These dog people completely circled the guy. Canis and Diaz just stood there and watched it all go down. The whole pack of dog people charged forward and started swarming Klaus. Diaz watched in total shock as they slammed Klaus to the ground and started licking him like crazy. Klaus had taken another massive L. He just claimed that they were getting way more efficient at it. Diaz knew Klaus was a hardened war veteran who had seen it all. The guy had even taken down powerful generals and earned the terrifying nickname Klaus the Decapitator. He never expected someone that. Diaz saw how worried Canis was, and honestly, it was starting to freak him out too. He skipped the lecture about their duties and decided to just show them exactly what he meant instead. Military dogs were a total mess during the war, so he decided that human dogs would be way more effective. Since it was just some random robbers hitting the plains, Diaz figured the dog people wouldn't have to deal with anyone actually dangerous. The crew was hanging out deep inside the tomb of Sansarif's first king, checking out all the insane jewels they found. Princess Diana warned everyone not to touch the coffin, or She gave the statues a big grin as she snatched up the scepter, looking super satisfied. Right then, a girl asks what she's planning to do with that scepter, and Diana just smirks, saying she's definitely going to use it. She starts telling the epic legend of the kings who built this world. Diana thinks they should take out Diaz first, build a massive army, and then just conquer the whole country. Diana tells the girl she can totally relax and stop worrying. She reveals that she's actually got a secret plan ready to go. The girl is completely blown away by this. Diana flashes the royal seal, and the woman totally loses it, screaming that Diaz ended the war just to turn down her offer. She'd heard Diaz was a total beast to everyone, and she was convinced all his fame was just fake hype. She was dead set on getting justice. Her teammate thought Diana was straight up losing it, and she realized she had to go tell Richard everything right now. Just then, the blonde kid finally made it to the royal tomb. He started laughing because he couldn't believe how easy it was to trick the royals. He honestly thought Diana was a total, but this was the big break he needed. He was finally going to handle Diana and Diaz. He also wanted to get revenge on everyone who ever messed with him. This guy was going to become the... Later that night, Prince Richard finally showed up at the royal hall, but he spent the whole time hiding right behind Diana. Literally everyone was convinced that Richard was the one who attacked the royal tomb, but they were totally sure they didn't even need to step in. Richard sits down and tells them there's no way they can calm the enemies down because they might run right into Diaz. Everyone asked how this connected to the Last Order, so Richard blamed everything on Diaz and said Diana was taking a massive risk. Richard starts rattling off every single nickname Diaz has. He brings up that old law from the war and mentions how Diaz was actually being super kind. Richard says Diaz's nicknames are actually wrong, and tells a story about Diaz hearing creepy noises in a barn, where he rushed in to find a girl surrounded by a bunch of guys. The guy lets the girl go and ties up the boys, and when one of them starts making excuses, Diaz just grins and clocks him. Since the guy was a noble, Diaz got dragged straight to the royal court, but he stood his ground until the king totally backed him up, forcing everyone else to agree and finally closing the case. Richard reports the situation and warns everyone that Diaz doesn't care about rank. He'll take on anyone, so you'd better not mess with him. One noble claims Diaz wouldn't dare touch the king, but Richard says this has actually happened before, and now everyone is leaning in as he starts to explain exactly how it went down. A guy walks up to Richard and says there's something he's just gotta know. Why did the king kick Diaz out to the edge of the kingdom? Richard hated the guy's vibe and told him he was dead wrong, because his dad never actually kicked him out. Richard says the king totally trusted Diaz to guard the plain since they needed someone they could actually count on. And after he mentions how his dad really felt about Diaz, the guy just asks if Diaz breaks down the mess the country is in, and why everyone needs to trust him, explaining that his dad had a solid team and all the gear ready until Misa's crew stepped in and ruined the whole plan. The girl walks right up to Richard and asks him straight up, which members of the royal family did Diaz actually hurt? The whole room goes dead silent. Richard looks totally annoyed. His guards let out a massive sigh, and the girl is shocked when a servant suddenly walks right up to her. The servant explains how Richard got totally cornered by the enemy, and Diaz had to bail him out, only to smack him on the head for being a total idiot. Richard admits that's the hardest anyone has ever hit him. Then while they're locked up, Diaz starts lecturing him, and the girl is totally shocked by the whole thing. The servant says this turned Richard into a hard-working, honest guy who grew up to be a total heartthrob prince. But Richard insists he would have changed his ways anyway. Richard still feels like he owes Diaz big time, and he's convinced they need to get rid of the losers before it's too late, so he snaps his fingers in a huge... The guy grabs the bag of cash and says they're gonna handle Diana. Richard demands that he gives back the royal seal immediately. The guy won't budge and asks to be paid back. Back at the village, the girls are cracking up because Diaz has a white mustache. But then Aruna points out the twins have them too, and everyone just loses it. Diana was screaming her head off inside the house because everyone had ditched her, even though she totally thought she was doing the right thing. She stared at the scepter and smirked, knowing she was finally about to rule the whole country. Dia suddenly felt something super weird, so when Aruna asked what was up, he just played it cool and pointed at the food, making Aruna tell him to stop being so cringy while the human dog gets smacked right in the head, so Klaus apologizes and checks if she's okay while Canis freaks out and runs around with a first aid kit. Klaus and Canis lock eyes one last time, but they both realize it'll never work and just turn their backs on each other. Diaz yells at Sidori to raise the gate, and the massive pit instantly floods with water. The dog people were absolutely hyped now that the reservoir was finally finished. Diaz was hyped they finished the water reservoir right before summer hit. He was also super stoked about how much extra food they were growing. Diaz was lost in thought until Bayars suddenly yanked on. Bayanor's was totally supposed to be his horse. DS was a total disaster at riding, but Aruna basically forced him onto a horse while everyone else grabbed the other three and took off like total pros. Beers started yanking on Diaz's hair again, and the guy actually thought horses were smart enough to understand every word he said. Diaz didn't mind the horses being total jokesters, but the second he hopped on Bayars, he was in for a real struggle. Bayars and Diaz head over to the twins' field and find the girls totally knocked out. While the girls dreamed of their parents, Diaz smiled at the horse and decided to let it loose so it could sleep right next to them, and the horse actually did it. Jallant zooms right up to Diaz to ask what's up, and the bird tells him that Elden sent a huge message and needs an answer ASAP. The message revealed that Diana marched straight into the Kazdek's mansion a few days ago, and forced Elden into a meeting he couldn't say no to. She told Elden she was taking Diaz down and demanded his help, and since it was a royal command, he was totally stuck and had to say yes. She whipped out the official orders that spelled out every rule and goal for their new team-up. The letter wasn't written the official way, but the guy's eyes went straight to that royal seal. Elden was sure this order was a total fake, but since it had that official seal, the law says it's 100% legit. Elden checked out the order and told Diana he needed to talk to his advisors because the conditions were making him super nervous. Elden acted like a nice host just to buy some time, because he had zero plans to help Diana and actually wanted to take down her entire crew. One of the advisors told Elden he seriously needed to start thinking about what comes next. Elden straight up refused to fight Diaz because he knew all about his legendary wins and believed he was the only hope for their world's future. Elden wanted to shut Diana down, but he had to handle her squad first, so the whole group couldn't agree on a single thing. One advisor piped up to ask what the boss thought about Diaz, insisting they needed his take on things, but the guy just said he'd already sent a message and was waiting for a reply. Elden says they need to hit the pause button on the meeting, and the advisor admits his daughter's letter really got him thinking. Just then, Jallant zooms into the hall, and as Elden's hyping him up and asking what Diaz said, the dove stands tall and tells him to just read the letter himself. Diaz opened the letter and his jaw dropped, while all the advisors started whispering like crazy. An advisor asked what the letter said, and the messenger revealed that Diaz wants Elden to team up with Diana. Every one of those advisors just stood there with their jaws on the floor. Right then, Canis walks up to Klaus and asks him what he's actually looking for. Klaus announces he's about to throw down with Diaz, so Diaz decides it's finally time to tell Canis how he really feels. Canis screams at the top of his lungs that he's totally in love with her. The girl is totally shocked but finally admits she loves him back, and Diaz is losing his mind watching it all go down. Canis and Klaus start talking about their future, and she tells him he's the only thing in the world she cares about before he pulls her into a hug. The girls are super confused, but Arina suddenly shows up and drags them away, telling them not to freak out. Klaus promises he's definitely coming back alive from the huge battle that hugs Canis tighter. She's crying her eyes out and promises she'll wait for him while a bunch of dog people line up, totally confused about what's going on. Morning hits, and Diaz and Klaus are standing out in a field. Diaz says it's finally war, and Klaus lowers his telescope because he totally agrees. 5 days later, the war finally kicked off, with Diana and Elden leading their massive armies while Diaz showed up with Ima and the dogmen. IMA tagged along with Diaz to act as their go-between. Their whole squad was just 12 fighters, including Diaz and Klaus. Diaz made sure every single warrior was fully geared up. Klaus realizes Diana has way too many warriors and starts wishing they'd called for backup, or just let Arunas help them. Dia explained that Aruna had a massive mission. She had to keep the village hidden and protected at all costs. Klaus still really wants Elden on his team, and Diaz says he told the guy to just stick to the royal orders. But even though Elden has leaked secrets and sent shady letters, Diaz figured Elden's army was a total joke, so he focused everything on protecting his own people. But he's low-key worried Elden saw right through him. So Klaus asks if Diaz says they're just following the plan, and then he starts explaining exactly how it's all gonna go down. The guy was totally on edge, and even though the grave dogs could sniff out exactly where the enemy was hiding, he still wasn't sure if their plan would actually work. If the plan flops, Diaz is ready to go solo and hunt down Bayar deep in enemy territory. But he's keeping his secret mission totally hidden from the others. He could have just rebuilt his tent and kept moving to stay away from the enemies, but that meant ditching the twins. He saw that because he was looking out for her, she finally stopped crying about their parents at night, and he knew this was a massive deal for both of them. He pictured the girls and what would happen if their fields were ruined, so he gripped his weapon tight and swore he'd protect them no matter what. Ima spins toward Diaz and points right at the bell the bad guys are holding. He explains that this war bell used to give orders during battle, but now he just treats it like a dusty old antique. The bell starts blaring. Ima clamps her hands over her ears, and Klaus and Diaz's eyes go wide with total shock. That bell just keeps on ringing. Diaz explains that this non-stop noise is actually the signal for a massive all-out attack. He tells Ima to bolt the very second the sound. He's not worried about them moving in. He's just waiting for the strike and wondering what Diana is really up to. Diana and her squad geared up, while Diaz shouted for every single warrior to get into their battle positions. He's got no clue what these guys are planning, so he decides to just wing it and grips his weapon even tighter. The bell rings and the fight is officially on as Diaz shouts for everyone to get ready. Diana's army squared up, ready to scrap. She had 4 whole squads out on the field at once. Everyone was just waiting for the first move, holding their breath. Diaz hoisted his massive axe as Diana's squad charged straight at him, but he just stared them down with a look that said they were in big trouble. The fighters stopped dead in their tracks and stared each other down. Klaus and Diaz were totally confused why the warrior just froze, and while Diaz was still trying to figure it out, Klaus noticed Diana's guards suddenly rushing out to the left and right. DS is totally stumped and wonders what kind of crazy plan Diana has cooked up. Camelot served Elden some tea, and the guy actually took a second to thank him. A knight rushes right up to them and asks what they're even doing. Elden flashes a smirk and tells them it's finally time for tea. The knight is totally stunned, but Elden just explains that his dad made him promise never to miss tea time, so that's way more important to him than anything else. The knight asks Elden if he's actually serious about defying the king's orders. Elden says he's just following orders and reminds Diana that he's already helped her out way more than he had to. Elton's sure the elite guards around her are more than enough, reminding everyone they've only got 2 enemies to deal with. Elden lays down the law while casually sipping his tea, and once he drains the cup, he demands a refill that Kamala's immediately goes to get. One of the fighters scratched his head, thinking it was super sketchy that nobody would touch this job even with the massive payout. He never thought they'd actually take on Diaz, so he didn't even rush as he turned around to get out of there. His soldiers ask if he's for real, but he tells them they have no shot at beating Diaz, reminding them that the guy is actually a hero who saved their whole country. He couldn't figure out why Duke Castex's army was just standing there, so he told anyone who wanted to fight they could stay. But everyone just followed the captain and cleared. A guy sprints over to the captain asking what's happening, but the captain just brushes him off and says goodbye, leaving the man totally confused about why they're even leaving. Diaz peeks through his telescope and sees the mercenaries backing off for some weird reason, realizing Elden is just buying time and thinking Diana's whole plan is a total bust. Diaz saw it was just Diana's soldiers heading their way, and after one look, he knew these guys should probably just turn around and run. Diaz says they need to switch things up, and after he explains the new move, Cloud just gives a big smirk. ES tells Ima to cover her ears for a second, then he takes a massive breath. DS lets out a massive scream, and suddenly the whole night just freezes in place. Aruna heard the battle cry and knew things were finally getting hot. Aruna tells the dog people they've gotta back Diaz up, and honestly they're all totally down for it. Right then, an old grandma is sitting inside one of the yurts, busy arranging stones on the floor. She stepped out of the yurt and everyone on the street swarmed her, dying to know how it all went down. The old lady told them everything was totally fine, and honestly, everyone was just super happy. Elden was watching the whole thing through his binoculars and asked his servant to check out how Klaus and Diaz were throwing down. He says Diaz is a total beast, and Klaus is the one always backing him up and watching his back. The guy was blown away by how much these little creatures were helping out. He honestly thought they were too clumsy to fight, so seeing them in action was a total surprise. Elden realized right then that Klaus keeps on fighting, thinking back to the promise Canis made him just as a knight suddenly takes a massive swing at him. Diaz shouts a warning and Klaus manages to dodge just in time. Klaus deflects the knight's strike and turns to Diaz, who points out a snake slithering right under his feet. Klaus spots the snake, and Diaz warns him it was super deadly, saying they've almost finished off Diana's troops but need to stay sharp. Diana watched the whole fight go down and she was absolutely fuming. She had no idea why they were ignoring her, so she started screaming and swinging her scepter around like crazy. Out of nowhere, an arrow whizzes past her and knocks the scepter right out of her hands, so she dives off her horse to see where that shot came from. Aruna was busy letting arrows fly when some dog people nearby started asking her what the deal was with Diana. She turned to the dog people and told them to grab the scepter and Diana's horse, decided she was going to kick that woman right off the plane, and gave the pups a quick head pat as she gave them her orders. Aruna charged ahead, determined to freak Diana out so she'd finally learn her lesson. Diana bolts for the woods to make an escape. Out of nowhere, an arrow slams into the tree right in her path. She freezes for a split second but keeps on sprinting. Right then, she fired off another arrow but missed the mark because she was still doubting herself. Then out of nowhere, a group of people snatched Diana up while Aruna just stood there completely stunned. The guy who snatched Diana says he totally didn't expect to run into his target out in the woods. They knocked the girl out cold in a flash. Then the leader checked his watch and complained they were running late. But one of the mercs snapped back that it was actually his fault they were behind. Suddenly, an arrow streaks right at them, making the mercenaries whip out their weapons and scramble to find the attacker. The guy grabs Diana and warns her that Diaz's crew is still hunting her down. He begs the guy to stop, swearing that he and Diaz are actually buddies. He explains they're only there because Diaz's student sent them. He grabs the bag and shouts that Richard is the... Just when he thought he was safe, an arrow sniped his bag of cash and sent it crashing to the ground. The guy says he totally gets it, so they're leaving the cash behind and taking Diana instead. Arunal just stands there and watches as those mercenaries turn tail and run for their lives. She grabs the bag, finally starting to think this guy might actually be telling the truth. She actually pulled it off and scanned their souls. Aruna heads back to fill Diaz in on Diana, and since she figures he's totally wiped out, she decides to whip him up a meal. She started obsessing over how to make Diaz happy, and just the thought of giving him a massage made her turn bright red. She sprinted back with a huge smile on her face, looking totally hyped. Diana's knight screamed that he was finished and begged for mercy, while Diaz explained they only lost because their heavy gear totally drained them before the fight even began. Klaus thrusts his spear into the air and tells his crew to scream for victory since they just wiped out the enemy. They basically took everything from the bad guys, from their weapons to their... Diaz's squad is totally fine without a single scratch, and while the enemy is definitely beat up, nobody actually died. But Diaz is mostly just annoyed that Diana slipped away before he could. Out of nowhere, something chomps down right on Diaz's head. The attacker tells him he doesn't have to kill anyone if he's not feeling it. He could've. If Diaz jumped in, who would even be in charge, and how could anyone survive a war fighting like that? But Diaz says they have a teammate they trust to handle the lead and all the small stuff. Out of nowhere, Diaz calls out to Elden. He pulls up on his horse and says they're here to talk about surrendering and letting the prisoners go. Elden immediately starts asking. The guy asks Elden what he means by surrendering, so Elden explains that marching an army into Diaz land without permission is a total act of war that breaks the kingdom's laws. With Diana missing, the royal order is totally falling apart, so they try to surrender to Diaz, but he just asks why he'd even bother making peace with them now. Diaz calls out Elden, saying all this talk about surrendering and making peace is just a lame excuse, and Elden actually nods in agreement. Diaz agrees to make peace and says he's actually super grateful this time, so he's totally cool with them doing whatever they want. Elden thanked Diaz for helping out just like Ima said, and now he's heading straight to the king to see if his big gamble actually pays off. Diaz is totally blown away that Elden is actually trying to cut a deal with the king, and when he asks how making peace would even benefit them, Elden admits she isn't sure. Elden says the king is actually to blame this time since he let someone steal the royal seal. This is a total disaster because now the bad guys are using it to forge official documents. To make things worse, they let Diana slip away and got dragged into a fight they never wanted, so DS is totally right. He's just paying the price for the king's massive screw-up. Elden is totally ready to milk this situation for everything it's worth, and after they settled on the payment, DS admitted it was a tough talk, but told Elden he could use. Diaz told him to just holler if he needed anything else, and Elden gave him a quick thanks. Out of nowhere, Elden and Diaz's assistant sensed something weird, and then a voice told Diaz he did an awesome job. It was Aruna. She told him his bravery was the real deal. Then for breakfast, she mixed those stimulant herbs from the leader into the food, and it looks like they actually worked. Diaz started asking about energy-boosting herbs as he remembered the chief's words, suddenly realizing it was super weird how no one felt tired after that massive fight. He asked why Aruna was using herbs to have a baby right now, and she told him Moru said they give off a special kind of energy. Aruna was forced to look after Diaz, but Mora knew all that constant fighting would eventually turn into a real relationship between them. This guy is definitely going to make a huge scene about this later. Then the girl said she ran into some dude while she was chasing Diana. They claimed they were just following orders from Richard. They said Richard was going to look after the lady and even hooked Diaz up with all this cash, making him seem like the most polite kid ever. But Diaz is just sitting there trying to remember if he had a ton of stuff he wanted to ask Aruna. But since they were finally done, they just decided to head off for the day. After handing the prisoners over to Elden and scoring some sweet rewards as payment, the group finally started the slow trip back home to Iluk village. Diaz suddenly spots the dogs, but Arunus explains they're actually the women's group from Iluk village sent to scavenge all the loot from the battlefield. Aruna and the dog-human housewives probably started the Iluk village women's society, and while he thought they were just hanging out, it turns out Aruna actually trained every single one of them for battle. The S thought he was the one telling Aruna to save the village, so he basically told him he should have given him a heads up first. Aranar told him she already said it, but Diaz wasn't even listening, so he got caught off guard and apologized to her. Suddenly, Diaz spots a sorority member with a weird staff in her mouth and calls her over to get a closer look. Diaz grabs the staff, and as Aruna asks what it is, he explains that the gem is loaded with magic, and he's gonna pump some mana into it to see what happens. Aruna tried to pump her magic into the staff, but absolutely nothing happened, and it felt just like a regular old rock. DS grabs the staff and gets hit with a super weird feeling, like he's holding a massive battle axe, or maybe it's just Aruna's magic surging through his body. He locks in, and suddenly the snake eyes on his staff start glowing before a massive blast of fire explodes right out of it. Aruna thinks this power is just like his axe, while Klaus and the assistants start asking a ton of questions about the fire pillar and what Diaz really did. Baruna asks if Diaz can handle fire, hoping the gear isn't a total mess. Then she just snatches the staff and tells him it's hers now. A little while later, they finally head back home where Sene and Ishing link up with Diaz. Klaus reunites with his girl Canis, and the big war between Diaz's village and Diana is officially over. They ran a bunch of tests on the staff and Diaz's power, but they quickly realized he's the only one who can actually use it. Diaz tries to explain that if he treats it like fixing a battle axe, fire pops out, but he's terrible at explaining it, so Aruna just pumps magic into the staff and Diaz blasts the flames. He says this staff is totally cracked because it starts fires instantly, making it way easier than using flint, so Diaz decides to use it to light up the whole village. A month later, summer is heating up and the whole city is gossiping about the criminal Diana, who stole the royal seal to start a rebellion, but Prince Richard caught her in the act and threw her in jail. Elden is the heir to the legendary hero of the West, Duke Kazdex, and thanks to his report, the hero's stolen rewards were finally found, leaving 4 of the second prince's men in some seriously hot water. The king was so furious that he kicked Diana out of the family, and while she managed to stay alive, she was sent straight to a temple prison. This deal was a total game-changer for Richard, scoring him the king's trust and bringing Diana's old followers and the Mies refugees to his side until he officially had the biggest faction in the kingdom. Elden showed up with a ton of secrets and rare Western goods, winning the king's trust so completely that he walked away with a noble title and his own land. To make up for the drama with Diana, he was even allowed to pick out a brand new last name. On top of that, the king gave him a massive 3-year tax break as... A little while later, Richard finally walks out of the room, leaving his crew totally confused about why he's actually in a good mood for once. But it's clear he's the only... The guy explains that Richard thinks the Duke of Castex is winning, but the Duke actually played him the whole time, and that 3-year tax break is a total disaster. This is totally wrecking the tax money from the Western trade routes, and since Duke Kazdex isn't paying up, he's getting way too powerful. Duke Castex announced to the whole crowd that he's backing Richard for the throne, which basically traps Richard so he can't mess with the Duke's business without looking like a total traitor. You can't just turn on your own team, and since the king won't cancel those tax breaks, Richard is losing his mind that everything is going exactly how the Duke wanted. Rumors about the hero Diaz were spreading like crazy, saying he was kicked out to a cursed land with absolutely nothing, but then he used a holy axe to smash the curse. He soloed the Earth Dragon all by himself, led 100 people to build his own city, and even married the most beautiful girl in the world. The king is dead set on making Diaz a duke, giving him a cool new last name and making him completely tax-free. It sounded like a total lie at first, but once Elden confirmed it from the capital, crazy rumors started blowing up all over the kingdom of Sansari. It spread all the way west across the plains to Diaz, affecting every single person and place in its path. After all the craziness, Aruna tells Diaz that things are finally chilling out, and Diaz totally agrees, saying they need to get ready for a brutal summer starting first thing tomorrow. Aruna looks over at the sleeping twins and tells Diaz she can help him chill out, suggesting he lie on his stomach while Diaz gives her a quick thanks. Aruna walks right up to the guy and tells him he can count on her whenever he needs, promising to give it her all to back him up, and he thanks her for the support. Aruna tells him to get some rest today so he isn't exhausted for tomorrow. But Diaz just asks if she's actually serious. While Diaz and the crew were busy dealing with Diana, Francis and Francois headed west of Iluk village, which was super weird because those two are usually way too scared to do anything risky. Out of nowhere, Francis and Francois start bleeding, and even though the human dogs are talking to them, they can't understand a single word they're saying. Francis and Francois were busy chatting and making calls when a massive sound suddenly blasted through the air. The dogmen were totally caught off guard when a voice rumbled from deep underground, telling them it was way too early and they hadn't done enough yet. The dogman told Francis and Francois it was time to head home, but then he suddenly asked whose voice that was. They said they had to get back to the village and thanked the dogman for the help. Asti's group thought the whole thing was super weird, but once they heard the awesome news that... The next morning, Aruna asks Aisha if she still hates wearing a saddle, while Diaz gets the feeling that Diana used to be the one riding this horse. In the ancient language, Aisha means moon-haired horse, and it's the name of the beautiful ride that Diana the Runa absolutely adores. They rescued her after the big fight, but since she totally hates being ridden, they just focus on taking care of her instead. Aruna says horses get super loyal to their old owners all the time, so instead of forcing things, she just needs to wait for it to finally trust her. Suddenly, Aruna's horn flashes bright green as her magic sensors go off. She's got these traps hidden all over the village to catch intruders, but the magic only lets her know someone is... Suddenly, someone sprints up to Diaz yelling that something shiny and wet is heading for the village. So Diaz tries his best to get the dogman to chill out. Dogman says the intruder has a massive mouth, so Dia guesses it's Pigeon, and Aruna totally agrees. Peking is a frog merchant who used to visit the village. He probably asked him to spread the word about hiring and order the next batch. Diaz was pretty shocked that he actually found people ready. This frog shows up with all the tea on DS and the gear they ordered, introducing himself as Pajin Ray, Pajin Do's little brother, who's just there to drop off the delivery. DS was stunned, but Aruna pointed out that the voice and clothes were totally different, proving this definitely wasn't Page 2. The frogman explains that Paging Seed is a super-rich merchant family that made bank using land and sea routes, and he's actually one of the 7 sons of the 8th head of the Paging Octito family. Diaz asks what's up with Pagan Do, and Ray explains that the guy lost something huge during a trade and got suspended, so Ray is filling in as the rep this time. He brings up Ezra's first mission to find new recruits, but the reality is that nobody in the Beastmen country wants to move here unless they're coming as servants. Diaz can't stand servants, but his brother is trying every trick in the book since they're totally on their own. Bloodless are basically beastmen who've totally lost their animal side. They look exactly like humans and aren't any stronger than a regular person either. Nobody really knows why this happens. Fast forward a few generations, and that beast blood is totally gone. The king we have now actually loves the people without it. But man, the old kings definitely didn't feel the same way. Life for the Bloodlists was a total nightmare, and while they were desperate to leave the Beastmen, they weren't about to go to Sansari where everyone is super hateful and treats. Diaz married a half-human girl and welcomes every outcast with open arms, letting them go back home if they want, so now tons of people are ready to move to his world. Before bringing the Bloodless over, he made sure Diaz was actually cool with it, and it turns out Diaz was totally hyped to have them. DS mentions there's a lord nearby who's a total hero, freeing half-humans and beast folk from slavery, and while he hasn't seen the place himself, the new guys can join him, but they might want to head over there too, since he figures anyone who's had a rough time would be way better off living with the wealthy Elden. Page is totally blown away, and wishes Diaz had mentioned this sooner since it's a massive chance for a new trade. So he asks about setting up a route while Diaz realizes these brothers are basically the same person. Peking says sorry for getting carried away, and suggests they finally start trading, showing off a wooden box with a crazy mother-of-pearl vessel inside. Diaz tells Pagan to knock it off because that's just not his style. But then Aruna slams down a bag of gold and says they're gonna buy every cool thing they can find. Diaz asks if he's totally sure, since art is cool but you don't actually need it to survive. But Aruna fires back that you can't eat gold, and if nobody buys anything, the merchants are just gonna stop coming. They're gonna let him make some profit, so he sees them as big-time customers worth coming back for. And since they've got plenty of cash saved up, everything's going. Diaz says they can just sell the extra art to someone else and leaves the whole thing in Aruna's hands. Pagan says that kind of cash can buy a ton of gear, and even though he's running low, he's got some necklaces and a super pricey gem that's perfect for the lady. Aruna sees right through Paige's lie and tells her to quit joking, because she's got enough cash for extra dried and smoked fish, and wants every single box packed up right now. She realizes the necklace gem is a total fake and demands the real deal, while Paige offers to toss in a whole barrel of wine as a bonus. Paige says he's gonna end up totally broke, so he tells Aruna she needs to go back and haggle for a better deal, while Diaz just sits back knowing Aruna's got this in the bag. The dogman asked the geese how they got stuck there, but one of them nipped his paw, making him jump up and pop the cage open. These geese started hunting down the dogman, and she had absolutely no clue why they were after her. Out of nowhere, Maya showed up and asked what the heck was happening. It turns out these geese, you can just feed them leftover veggie scraps from the kitchen. These things grow super fast. They hit adulthood in only 6 months and can live for up to 50 years. These geese are basically feathered guard dogs that scream at thieves and peck any animal that messes with the crops. Plus you get free eggs, meat, and feathers from them. These geese are actually called birds of grace, and they look super healthy with their shiny beaks and perfect feathers. So Diaz tells Paige and Aruna he's definitely buying them. Paige starts crunching numbers for 6 geese and offers a 20% discount, making Diaz realize they're actually still in the middle of a deal. Paige tells Aruna he's got some merch on hold, and when Aruna asks what it is, Paige says he heard Diaz doesn't have an heir yet. He usually only shows this stuff to the high-class nobles, but he's making a special exception for her today. And even though it's pricey, the quality is absolutely top tier. He pulls out a weird outfit, and when Aruna asks what it's for, Paige explains it's part of a spell that's supposed to help a wife have a baby right away. Aruna wonders how you're supposed to have a baby with a pile of strings, and while Paige doesn't have the answers, he knows it drives human nobles crazy. So Aruna tells. The pile of gear just kept growing, and Diaz finally felt like this crazy bargaining war was over. But even though the price dropped, he was stuck with a ton of random junk he didn't even want. Diaz thought it was a tie, but Aruna and Paige totally disagreed, and since Aruna had the only real score, she crushed the deal while Paige sold off more than half his stock, including the... He thinks they both walked away with a fair deal, but Paige was actually trying to sell total junk for a high price, and Aruna saw right through her scam. She didn't hold it against him, but she wasn't dropping the price either, because just like DS said, Paige was making bank since Aruna was actually top tier. They ended up scoring a massive haul of food, house supplies, art pieces, 6 geese, and, just like you'd expect from Aruna, plenty of wine. The guys haul everything to the warehouse, and while Aruna is helping out, she finds a stash of weird outfits like dancer gear, warrior armor, waitress uniforms, and even stuff for guys. Aruna starts picturing herself in the clothes, but she quickly snaps out of it because having the twins around makes things super awkward, so she starts checking out the guys' outfits instead. Pagan's almost sold every single outfit, and he knows just one more big push will clear out the whole shop. After they finished packing up, DS thanked the squad, but then he noticed Aruna's face was bright red and asked what was up, making her totally freak out and deny everything. Paige tells Diaz they're heading out and asks if he has any requests for their next deal, so Diaz tells him to bring a ton of stuff for dog people next time. They've got a stash of gold and silver coins to use, and Paige says he's totally on it, telling Diaz to just trust him with the rest. Paige calls Aruna and promises to bring her something even cooler next time, making her blush as she insists she doesn't need a thing. Once PGN headed out, the grind really started as they rushed to build a barn for the geese and dig a ditch from the river to make a watering hole right next to it. He thinks they're fine without it, but since he heard it makes them grow way faster, he decides they've got to make it. The dog people rush over to Diaz to let him know they saved Maya's grandma and the others, and Diaz gives them a huge thank you for the backup. Diaz saw they were all covered in dirt and asked what was going on, so Maya explained she'd actually put them to work for the geese. The ladies were totally hyped and thanked Diaz for the awesome geese, especially since it looks like they're about to have even more birds in the mix. They handled business by grabbing wood from an old barn to build the coop without even asking Diaz, but it was all good since they had to get it done. DS thanked the squad for doing an awesome job, but then he realized he still hadn't rewarded the dogman for taking on Diana. He's giving out victory medals to every single person who helped protect the town, not just the warriors. So he tells everyone in Aluk village to meet up in the square right now. Soon enough, everyone meets up in the town square, where Diaz tells the dog people he's super thankful for their help in the fight against Diana, and announces that every single person is getting a gold. The fighters scored 2 coins each, while even the people off the battlefield got a win, and everyone was hyped as Diaz and Aruna started handing out the loot, with the parents taking the kids' shares. Diaz finally finished handing out the coins, but then the dogman suddenly spoke up, making Diaz ask what was going on. One dogman asks if he can punch a hole in the gold coin, and while Diaz is totally confused, another dogman sprints over saying they all want holes in theirs too. He asked why they were putting a hole in a gold coin, and while he wasn't saying no, he definitely wanted to hear their reason first. They told him to punch a hole in it so they could fit a string through. After that, they were going to loop the string and wear it like a necklace. They never wanted to lose that reward from... Diaz hands over a gold coin and tells them to use it as money to buy whatever they want, but the dog people surprisingly tell him they don't want it. Diaz couldn't wrap his head around why they were paid in gold and silver just to use those same coins to decorate the inside of the earth. Diaz thought he was finally getting a reward for all his hard work, but he was totally wrong. To them, it's a super special treasure to remember him by, and he'd normally let them do whatever they want, but he already told Paige to get those dog-human products ready. If they don't treat cash like real money, things are gonna get messy, so Diaz asks the dogman if he's actually obsessed with that gold and silver stuff. The dogman said they looked cool and shiny, but he wasn't really into them, so Diaz asked if the reward even mattered at all. Dogman says it's worth it for the happy memories, but Diaz tells him to give a reward he'll actually remember and just use straight-up gold. The dogman was totally down, saying this was the best prize he could ask for. Diaz was still worried, though, because he had no clue what would actually top that. He needed something. Aruna suggests using fangs and bones from Diaz's own hunts, and asks the dogman if he'd like a necklace handmade by Diaz as his prize. Everyone was super hyped and totally down for the idea. Aruna's called it a day and wrapped things up right there. As soon as the necklaces were finished, Diaz was going to hand them out too. Diaz thanks Aruna for the awesome deal. Because of her, everyone can finally get back to work. Aruna says the necklace is a cool reward, but she asks if he's got anything. Dia promises to make one for Aruna, but then he spots Senai, Ikin, and Ima, and asks if they've been there the whole time. So Ima explains she was just showing the... Sin and Ihan want necklaces too, so Dia mentions those black buffalo Aruna was talking about. Since the girls eat them all the time, he asks if they want some jewelry made from... Sena and Ahan pass on the necklaces, and while Diaz knows they're a pretty lame reward, they literally have no other materials to use. Aruna says you just have to put your heart into making something, because these human dogs don't care about expensive stuff. They just want Diaz's real feelings, so they obviously... Diaz has to carve every single piece with total focus and heart, maybe even adding a shiny gemstone to make it look absolutely sick. Aruna had some jewelry left to share with him, but Diaz was totally unsure if he could actually pull this off. Arunatal tells him not to stress because she's a pro at the details, and even if he's a total beginner, she's gonna show him the ropes so he learns super fast. Diaz thanks her, but he's low-key annoyed that he's so easy to read, especially since she's already reading his mind before he even speaks, making him wonder if she... Everyone flashes him a sweet smile, and Diaz gets all embarrassed because he finally knows exactly what's going on in their heads. After working on them for a bit, Diaz finishes the necklaces and is honestly surprised by how awesome they turned out. Out of nowhere, Aruna pops up to distract him, but Diaz tells her he's finally finished, and hands her the necklace to see what she thinks of his work. Aruna slips the necklace on and says it's a job well done, knowing the dog people are going to be super hyped. Diaz spent 3 whole days on just one necklace, and now he's stressing about how long it'll take to finish the rest. Arunas knew he could do it way faster now that he had the hang of it. He didn't even rush and just took things one step at a time. Then, suddenly, he realized. Diaz agreed to take things slow just like Aruna wanted, but then he noticed she had something on her mind and asked what was up, a moment Aruna still remembers perfectly. While Diaz was busy working, Arunas and the crew wanted to help out, so they decided to build a kamadaba, which is basically a massive cooking station with a bunch of stoves, as long. They're firing up every stove in the yurt to cook, but with so many people, it's getting super cramped and a total pain to lug all their gear and food back and forth. Ima suggested they build a whole new spot for Klaus's ovens, a fresh well, and a place to get all the washing done. She's planning to put a roof over the whole spot and fill it with ovens so they can cook way faster. Then she asks Diaz what he thinks of the idea. Diaz figures they want to cook and eat right on the spot with some ovens, and while he's down for it, he's wondering where they'll get the materials to build them under the roofs. Aruna figures they can just ask Camelos for a few stable roofs, and DS says he'll send a letter about it the next time Jalant visits. Everything is burning like it's no big deal, and since Candace is almost home, Diaz just says to tell her she's already taking off. Kendra stuck around Aluk village to see if the human dogs could handle the move, and based on how chill they're acting, she's sure everything is totally fine. Aruna says there's still a ton of work to do before Candace gets back, like making Klaus's yurt bigger, but he's sure Klaus is gonna give it everything he's got. She tells Diaz to keep at it, but he's skeptical, asking if Kness is really coming back and why they're even mentioning Klaus's yurt, which catches her totally off guard. She's totally clueless and says they've been on great terms for ages, while Canis heads back to his hometown to tell his dad the news. ES is totally blown away and asks how long Klaus and Canis have been this close, but Aruna wonders how he could have missed all the obvious vibes they were giving off during dinner. Diaz suddenly remembers that epic meal and asks if Canis is really staying with Klaus, but Aruna reveals they're actually getting married when the time is right. Since they're getting so cozy, maybe a baby is coming soon, and Aruna says Diaz is gonna grill them for all the details. Diaz was honestly so hyped for the two of them, but then they heard everyone shouting about how lucky Aruna was to snag the very first finished product. Aruna was totally obsessed with the product, but Klaus was screaming in his ear that it was a total disaster because he couldn't figure out the perfect engagement gift. A bit later, DS is chilling in his yard making necklaces, and he's actually a total pro now because Aruna was right. Focusing on one at a time is how you really get the hang of it. Suddenly, Diaz spots Sini and Ehen watching him from the distance and realizes they want necklaces too, so he tells them not to worry because he's making some for them as well. The girls burst through the door and bolted, leaving Diaz screaming at them to shut it behind them. Diaz was just closing the door when Klaus suddenly barged in to talk, but he immediately told the kid to relax and asked what was really going on. A little later, Diaz asks Klaus if he's seriously still clueless about what engagement gift to get for Canis's parents. Cloud agrees, but even though Canis says they're good, he still thinks they need to get way more prepared. Klaus asks if Diaz seriously gave Aron's parents an engagement gift too, and then he wonders what the guy actually got for the girl. Diaz explained he was basically forced into a marriage and handed over the Earth Dragon loot, which totally shocked Klaus, who immediately asked how Aron's parents reacted to that. Diaz said they were super hyped, and since Moru mentioned there were only about 30 black buffaloes or bulls to deal with, he knew he could totally handle it. DS explains that their traditions are the real issue, since they're terrified of losing their happiness if they give up that black buffalo, even though the guy already paid them in gold coins. She suggests using the rewards to buy a cool gift, but Klaus feels like he didn't even earn them, and says he's just happy with all the fame he's getting. He values things he earns with his own hard work most, and after hearing Diaz's story, he's so hyped to be just like him and Runa that he wants to give them his own. Diaz knew hunting that Earth Dragon was a total death trap, and he had no clue if they'd even be satisfied with the black buffalo meat instead. Diaz thinks back to those super soft and fluffy sheep, but first, he has to hunt a black buffalo and trade it at one village for some cloth. Klaus is planning to give May some high-grade fabric as an engagement gift, and since it's top-tier stuff, he's totally sure she'll find a million uses. Kamalos is totally blown away by how high-quality the Mia fabric is, and he's sure the girl's parents are going to be stoked. Klaus agrees, saying it's basically a trophy from their hunt and a legendary local specialty. Learning the secrets to hunting them would be awesome, but Diaz basically said his tips wouldn't help me at all. Klaus agrees, calling their moves totally insane, but he's ready to learn their style and gives Diaz a big thanks. 5 days later and Diaz is still grinding on that jewelry, but he says now that he's got the hang of it, he's moving way faster and should be totally done in just 2 or 3 more days. Aruna suddenly cuts him off to say Kana is back, and even though she apologizes for jumping in, he's totally down to listen since he's been waiting for the... She's finally back and her parents actually gave her the green light, so starting today, she's moving in as part of the family and promised to give it her all while asking him to look out for her. Diaz tells her she's got to look out for them too, and even though she's been through a lot, he wants her to give it a shot, so she agrees. Aruna asks about the report, which makes the girl realize she totally forgot she had one. So she explains that Elden and Camelos are missing because they headed straight for the royal capital. Her dad is officially the deputy lord now, and right as she announced her wedding, she also ordered them to build a spot packed with ovens. All the supplies and workers are coming later, so her dad is totally stuck there, meaning only her mom is going to make it to the wedding. She's heading off with Klaus to meet her dad for a huge party, so she asks DS to look after her for a few days, even though he thought the wedding was still a long way off. They couldn't start the ceremony until the Black Buffalo hut was finally over. But right then, Diaz realized they were forgetting something massive. The guy asks when they're heading out, and she says she's leaving this second, which totally shocks Diaz and Aruna. But then she asks if Klaus is going somewhere too. Klaus hunts black buffalo every single day, but he's only managed to get 2 in the last 5 days, so things are looking pretty bad for him. That matabi powder should have made this hunt a total piece of cake, but Klaus insisted on using his own crew, and that's exactly why they're in this huge mess now. The girls and his master offered to help him out, but Klaus stood his ground and insisted on making that engagement gift all by himself, no matter what. He didn't even use that tabby powder. No human dogs to help him, just him sprinting across the massive fields all on his own. He managed to snag 2 buffaloes without leaving a single scratch. She was super curious about what Klaus was up to, and while she loved the gift, the real prize was the massive influence he just handed her, meaning she could finally ask for help whenever. Canis swore she'd slap some sense into her husband if he acts like a moron, but Klaus has no clue how much it would destroy her if he actually got hurt or died. Her mom always said this was the best way to handle people like that, and her dad had to deal with it way too many times. Kana finally heads out and says bye to the group, but then Aruna starts waving like crazy out of nowhere, making DS ask her what she's even doing. Aruna says she just wants to do her duty as a wife if things go south. But when Diaz tells her to chill, she asks if he's seriously not going to stop her. Diaz said if he messes up enough to get slapped by Aruna, he totally deserves it and will just have to take it. Aruna smirked and asked Diaz if he'd actually gotten a gift for Klaus and Canis while the girls were busy setting up the huge party. But Diaz just told him everything was under control. He still hadn't figured out what to give him. Suddenly, Arunas just started practicing his attack. Diaz was determined to find a way to celebrate no matter what. And man, those strikes were... Once Klaus got that gift from Canis, he finally stopped being so stubborn, teamed up with the dog people using the matapi powder, and even started going on hunts with Canis. He totally killed it, and in just 3 days, he had all the black buffalo he needed. Right after that, Klaus and the squad headed straight for the next territory. Diaz waved them off, but inside he was totally panicking. He'd been so caught up making necklaces that he didn't have a single gift ready for them. He really thought that black... Aruna and the crew are in for a massive feast when they get back, but with time running out, Diaz feels too awkward to talk to her after saying everything was fine, so he heads straight to... Dia admitted he had nobody else to turn to, so he just went for it and spilled everything about the field, his deals with the pagans, and that crazy fight with Diana. He showed up with some loot from back then and told them to use it however they wanted, leaving the chief totally impressed by how he's always one step ahead before she decides to drop some helpful advice. DS can get a wedding gift ready in a flash, and since she's always got extra high-quality Mia Bedlinon lying around, she can hand it over right now. She says it's the perfect gift for newlyweds, making Diaz imagine them spending the night together, and he totally agrees since Claus is still way too immature. The chief complained that she'd never see a baby at this rate because even though they were married, they were acting way too innocent, so she decided to slip them some special medicine. She hands him a special hand-stitched charm to keep him healthy and make sure the baby is born safe, so Diaz takes it and thanks the elder. DS notices the pillow has totally different patterns on each side, which is super weird, so the chief decides to just give it to the guy. Diaz spots the bag and asks what's inside, so the chief tells him it's just medicine for a baby on the way. Just a few days later, workers and supplies rolled in from nearby towns, and it only took them 3 days to finish the oven room and the roof, plus they even hooked them up with... DS handed out 10 gold coins to everyone as a thank you, paid for all the supplies, and even though he was low-key stressed about the price, it looks like he didn't get ripped off. The next morning, the workers head back to the nearby territory, and Klaus shows up with a cart overflowing with souvenirs. The cart pulled over by a forest for a snack break, and the man thanked the kid for letting a total stranger join the trip, and even brewing him some tea. The guy says that's just how their foster dad raised them, and since they're all headed to the same spot, there's no way they're letting the old man travel alone. She said she had to find their dad right now, but then Klaus suddenly flashed through her mind. Diaz starts feeling super awkward and asks Aruna how he looks, but she tells him he's totally fine and asks him to lean down for a second. Then she reaches over and smooths out his messy hair. It's finally time for Claus and Canis to tie the knot, and with a host leading the way, they're mixing the kingdom's royal style with the dog people traditions Claus really wanted. Canis was dying to get his hands on the Oni tribe's secret traditions. This huge festival only happens in the village of Iluk. Even Canis's mom, Martel, showed up for. Diaz kicks off his speech by saying that nobody can make it through life alone. He explains that's why we find family by choosing to love someone else. Today, everyone is hyped to celebrate. When people want to start a family, they have to write the Holy D's blessing perfectly for the wedding, which is why they've had these scriptures drilled into their heads since they were. He still knows every single word by heart without messing up once. Back on the battlefield, he'd chant the funeral prayers whenever his friends fell. He'd recite the scriptures for life. Klaus remembered that day and begged him to lead the ceremony, so he's stepping up to do it since Saint Didier's rules are actually super simple. Show some love to everyone and yourself. Enjoy being alive, don't hurt people or steal their stuff, stay off their turf, and never treat anyone like trash just because of where they. It's crazy how people forget the obvious stuff, like how Saint Dio was always right there by the Founder King's side, using that legendary wisdom from the Holy Land to help him pull off his greatest feats. Once the kingdom was finally at peace, he built a massive temple to honor the gods, slept on sacred ground, and left behind tons of holy teachings. But he eventually passed away without ever having a wife. Everyone's gathered here today to eat, dance, and party like crazy while wishing these two the best future ever. With the food finally ready, they all dig in and the whole place turns into a massive party. Diaz decides to grab a piece too, noticing it's packed with walnuts. And once he realizes Sheenie and Ihan were the ones who made it, he tells them this nut bread is actually. The girls start getting way too loud, but as soon as Diaz calls them out for being rude, Sheenie and Ihan totally chill out. Someone gives Marf and Sidori the signal to go, and suddenly the dog people start chucking clouds all over the place. The dog people have this wild feast tradition where they parade a happy groom around the village to celebrate his marriage and let everyone know he's officially taken. They do this to stop any backstabbing or drama, and even though it feels pretty useless with the whole village standing right here, a ritual is a ritual. Then these dog people start closing in, beating him up because they're totally jealous of the groom's happy marriage in a weird ritual to show everyone they're single and looking for. Klaus was cracking up and having a total blast. The whole group was vibing and having a great time together. Klaus thanked everyone for being there to celebrate his brand new start. Canis shouted that she'd give it everything she's got, swearing they'd all finally be happy together with Klaus. The wedding was a total blast, and everyone was having the time of their lives dancing, singing, and eating tons of amazing food. Out of nowhere, Aruna walks up to Diaz and asks him to dance, but when he admits he's got zero rhythm, she just tells him she wasn't expecting much from him anyway. Check the one line in equals one line out rule. The input is 2 sentences in one block. I should provide one cohesive line. Diaz and Arunas finally hit the dance floor, and even though Diaz is super nervous at first, he sees everyone else vibing and feels Arunas leaning right into him. A little while later, the dancing and eating died down, and the whole place got that chill, special vibe you only get at the end of a huge party. It's finally go time, so Diaz hauls out the chest and tells the dogman to get everyone together so he can hand out necklaces as a reward for the fight. The dog people all swarmed Diaz, but he told them to chill out because there was enough for everyone to stand up one by one. He wanted to give them out right away, but since everyone was so busy, Klaus and the guys suggested waiting for the feast to finally hand those pendants over to the whole group. Canis is totally shocked and asks if the jewelry is really for her, but Diaz tells her to just take it as a sign that she's officially part of the village now. Scene and Aiken walk up to Canis and give her some cool embroidered handkerchiefs as a gift, and after she thanks them, the dog people hand over some awesome-looking stones they found on the plain. Francis and Francois handed over a piece of the Mia family treasure. Emma shared a poem for their happiness, and while Klaus was thanking everyone, he spotted some totally weird rock salt. ES wonders if anyone has ever mined anything like this nearby, while Diaz realizes he's definitely due for a gift too. Diaz calls over Klaus and Canis to give them a gift, and a totally shocked Klaus thanks him for the bedlanon. Aruna and Maya both hyped Diaz up because he actually knew all about the special bedsheets meant for having kids and safe births. Aruna tells Diaz to get the bedlanon to the yurt, and once he agrees, the whole group gathers to say they're leaving the rest of the work to the 2 young kids. Diaz didn't think talking about bedsheets meant they had to rush home before dark, but the party ended way earlier than anyone expected. Diaz was supposed to be the host of today's party, but Aruna told him he needed to help everyone out too, and he actually agreed. Meanwhile, those guys in the bearskins were hiding out in a cave when one of them announced he'd picked up the trail and finally knew where the village was. Word is some rich guy's been buying a ton of stuff from the Beast People's secret village on the Nutris Plain, and someone just spotted a carriage heading right for it. If she's heading for the village, they can just follow her tracks, and if they're wrong, they'll just jump the carriage because the strong always get to boss around the. This guy Hugus says he's going to rule over everyone, and it looks like a massive threat is heading straight for the village. As their carriage rolls across the empty plains, the guy asks if she's totally sure about this spot since it's literally just grass, but she's positive they're right because they're just west of Kazdex's territory. Out of nowhere, this dog girl jumps out and demands to know who they are, warning them that if they're bandits, she's gonna bite them, so they better get lost fast. Diaz was just chilling in his yurt. Summer had finally hit. Things were starting to change for him, though. Since Francois is pregnant and due in the fall, she's been spending most. She's not even sick. She's just in a total mood to get it done. So Francis keeps sprinting out to the meadow all day long, hunting for that perfect soft grass. He chewed the food up to make it soft, fed it to Francois, and then zoomed right back to the meadow. Aruna says his kind doesn't usually do this, so Francis must really care. Once his training and work were finished, he stayed by her side every night since the baby was coming any second. But then someone suddenly called out for Diaz. The dogman burst into the yurt and warned Diaz that a bunch of bandit-looking guys just showed up with a ton of ma. She said there are only 6 of those me's, and they seem super friendly. But Aruna told Diaz they had to bounce because Francois said their guests were waiting. She says anyone who's chill with Mia is safe, and she's totally on board with that, especially since they brought 6 Mias at once, so the Lord better show up and meet them himself. They get to the plane and Diaz spots backup, so he shouts for AESA and Array while Aruna asks if he actually knows these guys. I finally caught up to Diaz and called him both dad and brother, leaving Aruna totally stunned when she heard the girl call him father. Diaz mentioned how much they'd both grown and was just glad they were safe. Then he asked about the rest of the squad, and Eerie told him everyone was doing awesome, running shops and even getting married. Suddenly, a guy disguised as a woman bolts out of the cart, and Diaz is stoked to see Eric, telling everyone he's one of them and looking healthy, which makes Eric super happy. Diaz asked Eric if he was doing okay, so Eric told him to call Eerie while Mia rushed over, but then he just collapsed, said he was fine, and thanked the mayor. Diaz realized Francois was totally right about these kids, because even though Eric looked super creepy, all 3 of them were actually really sweet. Out of nowhere, Diaz spots Ben in another wagon and realizes he's actually alive. Diaz thought he was a goner, but Ben tells him to stop being so reckless, laughing that even though. Aruna walks up to Diaz and mentions his uncle is worried, but then he drops the big question. Why did that girl call him dad? Aruna started totally freaking out, asking a million questions about how Diaz already had a kid this big and who the secret mom even was. Aisu asks Diaz who the kid is, but Aruna suddenly yells that she's his wife, which totally blows Aisu's mind because the girl looks way too young, and that's literally. Aruna explains she's from the Oni tribe and doesn't know the kingdom's rules, so Isu apologized for being a jerk and asked her not to take it personally. Aruna apologized for accidentally being a bit inappropriate, while Diaz tried to explain who these kids actually were. Out of nowhere, Aruna's horn starts glowing, and as the girl spins around to look, she sees a whole squad of invaders appearing in the distance. Yuga introduces himself and lets Diaz and the crew know he's totally let down, calling them out for being greedy with their wealth and forcing everyone back into a fight because they refuse to share. They've taken each other out way too many times, so he's finally ready to make a deal, ordering Diaz and the crew to bow down because the strong rule the weak, and they have no choice but to follow him. The girl acts like she has no clue what he's saying and drops a mist spell, leaving Hughes totally stunned as they vanish right before his eyes. Ishu is totally stunned and asks if they're actually invisible, but Aruna tells him she used camouflage magic and they need to bolt right now, leaving Isu wondering if it's really just camouflage. Ayesu admitted they had no clue someone was tailing them, but she'd heard some rumors about a guy named Hugu. He actually used to be a knight for the kingdom. This guy has some seriously weird beliefs, and Aruna walks right up to Diaz to tell him he's got a plan. Hugai's assistant said they were nowhere to be found, and it was time to bail. But Hugai's just mocked them for being weaklings, promising to keep them safe as long as they handed. Out of nowhere, Diaz calls out Hugo, claiming he's the lord of this land and demanding a 1-versus-1 duel, while Puyugas is totally shocked to see the legendary hero who saved the whole country standing right there. Aruna stood right next to Diaz, hyping him up and telling him to repeat every single word she said. Diaz tells Hugo that if he wins, Diaz will follow him, but if Hugo loses, he's the one taking orders, so they're gonna settle once and for all who's actually the. Hugh's assistant warns him it's a total trap, but Diaz just smirks and asks if he's too scared to drop his sword and fight, so Hugh tosses his blade. Aruna figured Hughes was finally cornered. Even for a bad guy, he actually wasn't lying about anything. You could almost say he was pure, or maybe he just acted. Hugues steps up to Diaz and tells him to bring it on, sparking a crazy fight where he demands to know how a lord from some far-off land got this insanely strong. Diaz calls Hugo out, telling him that nobody survives on their own, no matter how tough they are, because you only keep moving for your crew and family, since real strength is all about protecting and looking out for everyone else. Diaz tells Hugo he's got to step up his game, then decks him so hard he flies back into his assistant's arms, who realize they're way out of their league and need to bail. Aruna totally agreed, saying she wouldn't expect anything less from her husband. The girls all grinned as Aruna's reminded them they're basically Diaz's family now, so they've got to play nice to have his back, and Isue totally agreed. Aruna asked where their mom was so she could say hi, but the girl explained they're actually orphans who call their caretaker dad instead of teacher because they love him like. Aruna says she gets it, but Isu asks if it was too risky for them to meet up if Papa had lost, though Arunas just shrugs it off and says she would have handled them herself. When it comes to a contest of pure strength, Diaz isn't losing to anyone. Araya mentioned that for the longest time, everyone absolutely loved and looked up to his brother. Even Diaz stepped up and brought all these orphans together to form a massive family where everyone looks out for each other. And even while surviving on literal trash, he taught them how to read, write, and the value of putting in real work. Aruna was totally shocked that Diaz could actually read and write, and Isu explained that because of her brother, the orphans stopped their pranks and the town finally started to trust them. They started getting better jobs and finally turned their lives around. This is the Diaz they look up to. He's their leader, their brother, and their father all at once. They became a real... This guy standing next to him is Ben. He's actually Diaz's big brother and used to be a super strict temple minister. He was the one who taught Diaz everything when they were kids. Ayan and Sini asked if Diaz's parents were anything like him, but he told them they were actually the total opposite, super chill and kind. They were supposedly just doing random chores at the temple, and while Ben blamed them for not telling the kid the truth, it turns out Diaz's parents were actually the top 2 high priests in the entire ranking. These guys were actually high priests from the massive great temple in the east, which totally caught everyone off guard. So Aruna asked DS what kind of crazy temple it even was. Asa said the full story is a total drag, so here's the shortcut. Saint Daya and the first king headed to the Holy Land, met the gods themselves, and walked away with a crazy source of knowledge. He also grabbed some holy relics, and the first king used their insane power to build the kingdom and bring peace, while Saint Aya ditched the king to build her own temple instead. These temples are the perfect spot to spread the word about their holy leader. Once Saint Dia passed away, temples were built in every single corner of the kingdom. The priests inside worked. Plus, Saint Dia's teachings don't say a single thing about what God actually looks like, and honestly, half the stuff she says makes 0 sense to them. Ben says they built massive temples in the capital and in every single direction, and since they're so huge, they have a crazy amount of power. This fool's parents, brother, and wife were all high priests at the great temple of the east, but Irai called it like it is, asking if that place wasn't just a fortress for total villains. Ben totally gets why Irie said that since the priests have really hit rock bottom lately, and Diaz's uncle even told him about a massive internal war at the temple from way before he was born. Uncle Ben decided to end the beef by heading straight to the Holy Land to get some answers from God, leaving Diaz's parents in charge while he set off on his mission. He heads back to the kingdom only to find his wife and family are gone, his old school has vanished, and the temple is now totally rotten under a new rival group. He wanted to find his brother's family, so he did some digging and finally tracked Diaz, the high priest's only son, straight to the middle of a war zone. He asks Diaz if he knows how it felt to be called a brutal killer, and right then, he decides he's going to smash that idiot's head in no matter what. Since Diaz has such an awesome fiancée and is actually doing okay for himself, Ben decides to let him off the hook, especially after seeing that all those sheep, bats, and puppies are actually... So these two were just hyped to finally head back to Earth, and even though he knows Aruna has her hands full with such a clueless husband, he asks her to keep looking after him since he's totally lost without her. Aruna shakes Ben's hand and tells him she's stoked to meet her new uncle, but Ben tells her to drop the formal stuff and just call him something more chill. Eric suddenly snaps at Aruna, asking how she dares to act like his fiancée when they've actually been married for 20 years. Diaz is totally confused, but Eric tells him to call him Eerie, and brings up that old promise to buy her a ring when she grows up, which Diaz says was just a conversation about her birthday. He remembers promising Eerie he'd buy her that ring once he grew up and had the money, so now she's asking if he's straight up proposing. Ben turns to Diaz and tells him he's actually a guy, admitting he thought Diaz was a total weirdo when they first met. But Diaz just says he used to be a way more normal. Aruna says this kid's soul is shaped like a girl's, so he might actually have a female heart. Isui told DS that Sign and I Hen were the new little sisters, and while his fiancée was a total cutie, these kids were just as adorable. But then Eric suddenly... Later, Hugues was grinding in the fields with his crew, telling the guys they had to work hard since Diaz the strongman gave the order.